Something is wrong and you cannot say. Something is wrong and you cannot say what it is. And Jung believed this is where most genuine suffering begins, not with a visible wound, but with a quiet, nameless feeling that something in your life is misaligned, something you cannot point at, cannot explain, and cannot fix because you cannot identify it. The suffering has no address. It lives in a vague dissatisfaction, a persistent unease, a sense that the life you are living, however functional and however successful, is not quite the life you were supposed to be living. Jung called this the suffering of the undiscovered self, the pain that comes not from what has happened to you, but from what has not happened, from the parts of yourself that have been excluded, denied, or never allowed to develop. This is not depression in the clinical sense, though it can look like it. It is a signal from the unconscious, a message that the life you have built does not contain enough of who you actually are. Think of the last time you felt that something was wrong and could not say what. How the wrongness had no name and no solution. How it sat beneath an otherwise reasonable life, like a low hum you could not locate. You do not need to name it tonight. Let the nameless suffering rest, carrying its signal without demanding a response. And know that Jung saw this feeling not as a defect in you, but as the psyche's honest report that something essential has been left out, and that the inability to name it is not a failure of your mind, but a feature of a pain that lives deeper than language can reach. The pain that has no wound. The pain that has no wound is the psychological suffering that arrives without a visible cause, the hurt that cannot be traced to a specific event, a specific loss, or a specific injury, and that therefore cannot be treated by addressing a specific problem. Jung understood that much of human suffering is not caused by things that happened, but by things that did not. Not by wounds inflicted from the outside, but by an inner absence, a missing piece in the structure of the self that creates pain precisely because there is nothing to point at and say, there, that is what hurts. This is the most confusing kind of suffering because the person experiencing it often feels they have no right to be in pain. Their life looks fine. Nothing is obviously wrong. And yet the pain is there, real and persistent, defying every attempt to locate its source. Jung saw this as the suffering of the incomplete self, the pain of a psyche that has not been allowed to develop fully, that carries its missing pieces not as wounds, but as absences. Gaps where something should be and is not. Think of carrying a pain you cannot explain, and how the inability to explain it made the pain worse, because you felt you should be able to fix something you could not even find. You do not need to find the wound tonight. Let the pain rest, unwounded and real, and know that Jung saw the suffering without a cause as the most important kind, because it points not at something that happened, but at something that needs to happen, a part of you that is asking to be born. The ache beneath every busy day. The ache beneath every busy day is the suffering that hides under activity, the pain that only appears when the doing stops and the quiet arrives, which is why so many people avoid the quiet. Jung observed that busyness is one of the most effective defenses against the unconscious, because as long as you are occupied, the deeper feelings cannot surface, and the ache, which lives in the space beneath the doing, is kept at bay. But the ache does not go away because you are busy. It waits. It accumulates. And when the busyness finally stops, in illness, in retirement, in the small hours of the night, the ache is there, larger than it was when you first began to outrun it, because avoidance does not reduce suffering. It stores it. Think of the feeling that arrives when you stop, when the day is done and the tasks are finished and the silence comes, and how the silence carries something you have been running from: a heaviness, a sadness, a dissatisfaction that the day's activity kept at arm's length. You do not need to stop running tonight, though you have stopped here, in the dark. Let the ache surface if it will, gently, knowing that Jung saw the arrival of the buried feeling, not as a sign that something has gone wrong, but as a sign that the psyche is finally safe enough to deliver what it has been holding, and that the ache, however unwelcome, is the beginning of something more honest than the busyness could ever be. You were not built for the life you lead. You were not built for the life you lead. And Jung believed this mismatch is one of the deepest sources of human suffering: the slow, daily friction of living a life that does not fit the person living it. The life you have, the job, the role, the routines, the identity, was often not chosen from a place of self-knowledge, but assembled from expectations, opportunities, and defaults. And the person inside the life, the one who actually has to live it, may not be the person the life was built for. Jung called this the suffering of adaptation, the pain of a self that has been squeezed into a shape that does not match its nature, and that pays daily in exhaustion, resentment, and a quiet despair that no amount of success can fix. Think of how much of your life was built to fit someone else's expectations, and how the daily effort of fitting, of performing a role that does not come naturally, drains something from you that sleep alone cannot restore. You do not need to rebuild anything tonight. Let the mismatch rest, carrying its quiet friction. And know that Jung saw this suffering as the psyche's honest protest against a life that does not fit. A signal that the self inside the role is real and is asking, persistently, for room to be what it actually is. The exhaustion that rest cannot fix. The exhaustion that rest cannot fix is not physical tiredness but psychological depletion. The weariness that remains after sleep, after vacations, after every form of rest you can think of, because the source of the exhaustion is not in the body, but in the division of the self. Jung understood that the most draining thing a person can do is carry an inner conflict they are not aware of, fighting a war on two fronts, the outer life demanding one thing and the inner life demanding another, with the person caught between them, spending energy they cannot replenish because the drain is invisible. The ego spends enormous energy maintaining its defenses, holding the shadow down, keeping the persona in place, suppressing the feelings that threaten the constructed self. And this maintenance, which never stops, produces a fatigue that no rest can address, because the work never stops. Think of how tired you are in a way that sleep does not fix, and how the tiredness feels deeper than the body, as though the exhaustion lives in the self rather than in the muscles. You do not need to rest any harder tonight. Let the exhaustion rest alongside you, and know that Jung saw this particular tiredness as the cost of self-division, the price of keeping parts of yourself permanently suppressed, and that the cure is not more sleep, but more honesty, a gradual lowering of the defenses that are, silently and expensively, running in the background of your life. The happiness that feels hollow. The happiness that feels hollow is the achievement of everything you were told would make you happy, followed by the discovery that it did not. Jung encountered this in patient after patient, successful people who had done everything right, built the career, the family, the status, and arrived at the destination to find it empty. Not because the things they built were bad, but because the self that built them was incomplete. And an incomplete self cannot be satisfied by complete achievements. The hollowness is not ingratitude. It is the signal that the life was built by the persona rather than the whole person, and that the persona's goals, however impressive, do not feed the parts of the self that were excluded from the building. Think of a time you got what you wanted and felt nothing. How the emptiness after the achievement was worse than the longing before it. Because the longing at least pointed somewhere, and the emptiness pointed nowhere. You do not need to achieve anything tonight. Let the hollowness rest, carrying its honest signal, and know that Jung saw this suffering as one of the most important, because it comes only to people who have done everything right and still feel wrong. And it is the psyche's way of saying that rightness, by the world's measure, is not the same as wholeness, by the self's measure, and that no amount of outer success can fill an inner absence. The anxiety without an object. The anxiety without an object is the fear that has no target, the dread that floats freely through the mind without attaching to any specific threat. The worry about nothing in particular that is somehow worse than worry about something specific. Jung understood this kind of anxiety as a message from the unconscious, a signal that something below the surface is pressing upward, trying to reach awareness, and the ego, sensing the approach of unconscious material. It is not ready to face, responds with anxiety. A generalized alarm triggered not by an external danger, but by an internal one. The anxiety is real. The threat is real. But the threat is inside, which is why no external reassurance can reach it. Think of lying awake with a feeling of dread that has no name, no cause, no face, and how the absence of a target makes the fear worse, because you cannot address what you cannot identify. You do not need to identify anything tonight. Let the anxiety rest, floating and objectless, and know that Jung saw this particular suffering as paradoxically hopeful, because it means the unconscious is active, pressing toward the surface, trying to deliver something the conscious mind has been refusing to accept, and that the anxiety, however painful, is the sound of something important knocking on a door you have not yet opened. The sadness that arrives for no reason. The sadness that arrives for no reason is one of the quietest and most common forms of suffering. The mood that descends without cause, without context, without any triggering event, as though the sadness were coming from somewhere inside you that your biography cannot reach. Jung saw these causeless moods as expressions of the unconscious, communications from the deeper self that bypass the rational mind and arrive directly as feeling. The sadness is not about what happened today or yesterday. It may not be about your personal life at all. It may be the collective unconscious expressing something through you, a grief older than your own history, a sorrow that belongs to the species rather than to the individual. Or it may be the unlived self, the parts of you that have been denied expression, mourning their own exclusion. Either way, the sadness without a reason is not a malfunction. It is a message, delivered in the only language the unconscious has, which is feeling. Think of a sadness that arrived from nowhere and refused to leave, and how you searched for a cause and found none, and how the causelessness made the sadness feel both more mysterious and more real. You do not need to find the cause tonight. Let the sadness rest, arrived from wherever it arrived from, and know that Jung saw the unmotivated mood as one of the unconscious's most honest communications, a feeling that is real even when its source is invisible, and that the source, though hidden, is asking to be heard. The feeling of living someone else's life. The feeling of living someone else's life is the suffering of a person who has built an existence that looks right from the outside and feels wrong from the inside, as though the life belongs to someone else and they are simply performing it. Jung saw this as the consequence of over-identification with the persona, the social mask that was built to please others and has been worn so long that the person underneath has been forgotten. The life they are living is the persona's life, not the self's. And the feeling of wrongness, of living in someone else's house, wearing someone else's clothes, is the authentic self registering its exclusion. This suffering is particularly cruel because the person experiencing it often cannot justify it. The life is good, the achievements are real, the people around them are satisfied, and yet the person inside feels like an imposter in their own existence, performing a role that was never theirs. Think of looking at your own life and feeling that it belongs to someone you are pretending to be, and how the pretending has gone on so long you are not sure you can find the person underneath. You do not need to find them tonight. Let the feeling rest, carrying its honest protest, and know that Jung saw this suffering as the beginning of the most important journey, the return to the authentic self, which starts with the simple, painful admission that the life you are living is not the life you were meant to live. The numbness that replaced your feeling. The numbness that replaced your feeling is the shutdown that happens when the psyche can no longer afford to feel, when the pain or the conflict or the suppression has gone on so long that the mind, in self-defense, turns the volume down on everything, and the result is not peace, but emptiness, not relief, but a flatness that is its own kind of suffering. Jung understood numbness as a defense, the ego's last resort when the feelings pressing upward from the unconscious are too strong or too threatening to be experienced. The numbness protects, but it protects by removing the capacity to feel anything at all, the good along with the bad, the joy along with the pain. The person who is numb is safe from their suffering and also cut off from their life, present in body and absent in experience. Think of a period when you stopped feeling, when everything went flat and distant, and the world continued around you without quite reaching you. The numbness was not nothing. It was the psyche under siege, protecting you from something it could not let you feel. You do not need to feel anything tonight. Let the numbness rest if it is there, or let the feelings flow if they will, and know that Jung saw the shutdown not as an absence of self, but as a defense of the self, a temporary withdrawal from a world that had become too much, and that the return of feeling, when it comes, is not a collapse, but a thaw, a sign that the psyche is ready, once again, to risk being alive. The question your comfort cannot answer. The question your comfort cannot answer is the one that persists despite every material need being met. The nagging, existential wondering that no amount of safety, security, or success can silence. Why am I here? What does this mean? Is this all there is? Jung heard these questions from the most comfortable people, the ones who had everything and felt nothing. And he understood the questions not as luxuries of the privileged, but as signals from the deepest layer of the psyche, the self, demanding a life of meaning in a world that offers only a life of comfort. The question cannot be answered by more comfort because the question is not about comfort. It is about meaning. And meaning is not found in what you have, but in who you are becoming. And becoming requires exactly the kind of discomfort that the comfortable life is designed to prevent. Think of the question that keeps returning, the one your achievements cannot silence, and how the returning of the question, despite every effort to answer it with success, suggests that the question is not about success at all. You do not need to answer any question tonight. Let it rest, persistent and unanswered. And know that Jung saw this particular suffering as one of the most important signals the psyche can send, a call to depth in a life that has settled for surface, a demand for meaning that no comfort can meet, and that the suffering of the question is, strangely, proof that something in you is still alive enough to ask. The suffering that opens a door. The suffering that opens a door is the quiet conclusion of this first tier, the recognition that the nameless suffering you have been feeling is not an enemy, but a messenger. Not a sign that something has gone wrong, but a sign that something is trying to go right. Jung's most radical insight about suffering was that it is purposive, that it serves a function in the psyche, that the pain is not a malfunction, but a signal, pointing towards something that needs to change, to grow, to be born. The suffering you cannot name is the door the unconscious is trying to open, and the pain is the pressure of the opening, felt from the inside by a person who does not yet know what is on the other side. Every form of nameless suffering discussed tonight, the ache, the exhaustion, the hollowness, the anxiety, has been the psyche knocking, telling you that the life you have built is not the life you need, that the self you have become is not the self you are, and that the way forward runs not around the pain, but through it. You do not need to walk through any door tonight. Let the door rest, half open and patient, and feel the quiet, truthful comfort of knowing that the suffering you carry is not meaningless, that it is pointing somewhere, and that Jung, who spent his life studying the dark places of the human mind, believed that the pain, honestly faced, always opens into something larger. You are at war with yourself. You are at war with yourself. And Jung believed this inner war is the root of more suffering than any external conflict could produce. The war is between the conscious self, the ego, the version of you that manages daily life, and the unconscious, the vast interior that holds everything the ego has excluded. The ego wants control. The unconscious wants expression. And because the ego cannot control what it cannot see, and the unconscious cannot speak in the language the ego understands, the two exist in a state of ongoing tension that the person experiences as suffering, as anxiety, as restlessness, as the feeling that something inside is pulling in a direction you cannot identify. Jung saw neurosis itself as a civil war within the psyche, the conscious and unconscious purposes working against each other, each one undermining what the other is trying to build. Think of the times you have sabotaged yourself, acted against your own interests, made choices that confused even you, and consider that these may not have been failures of will, but expressions of a war between two parts of yourself with different agendas. You do not need to end any war tonight. Let the conflict rest, as it rests when the ego loosens its grip in sleep. And know that Jung saw the inner war not as evidence of your brokenness, but as evidence of your complexity, a sign that you contain more than one voice, more than one need, and that the suffering is the sound of the voices arguing, each one real, each one valid, each one refusing to be silenced by the other. The part you fight is part of you. The part you fight is part of you. And this is the cruelest irony of the inner war, that the thing you are fighting is not an invader, but a resident, a legitimate part of your own psyche that you have declared unwelcome. The anger you suppress, the desire you deny, the vulnerability you refuse to show. Each one is a genuine part of you, exiled by the ego's need for a coherent, acceptable identity. And each one fights back from exile with a persistence that the ego's defenses can delay, but never permanently stop. Jung observed that the harder you fight a part of yourself, the stronger it becomes, because the energy of the fighting feeds the very thing being fought. Suppression does not weaken. It strengthens through resistance, the way a river dammed does not disappear but builds pressure. Think of the part of yourself you have fought longest and hardest, and how the fighting has not reduced it, but given it a desperate, pressurized quality, as though the thing you are trying to eliminate were growing more powerful with every effort to destroy it. You do not need to stop fighting tonight. Let the war pause, as it pauses in sleep, and know that Jung's most compassionate insight was this: that the thing you are fighting is not your enemy but your exile, a part of yourself that was sent away and is trying to come home, and that the war will end, not when the exile is defeated, but when it is finally allowed to return. The ego cannot win this fight. The ego cannot win this fight because the unconscious is larger, older, and more persistent than the ego could ever be. And the fight itself, the ego's attempt to control the unconscious, is the primary source of neurotic suffering. Jung described the ego as a small, bright island in a vast, dark ocean. And the ego's mistake is believing it is the ocean, that its awareness is the whole of the mind, that what it does not see does not exist. The unconscious does not need the ego's permission to exist. It does not need to be acknowledged to be powerful. And it does not stop pressing upward just because the ego insists it should. The harder the ego fights, the more exhausted it becomes, because it is trying to hold back something infinitely larger than itself. Think of how tired you are from trying to control everything inside you, and how the control never quite works, and how the feeling of losing the fight is itself a kind of suffering that the ego would rather die than admit. You do not need to control anything tonight. Let the ego rest, as it rests every night in sleep, surrendering its control for a few hours to the very force it spends all day fighting, and know that the surrender is not a defeat, but a relief. The quiet, nightly proof that letting go of control does not destroy you, and that the unconscious, given room, does not attack. It dreams. The symptom is a message. The symptom is a message, not a malfunction. And Jung's approach to psychological suffering began with this radical reframing, that the anxiety, the depression, the phobia, the compulsion, the inexplicable mood is not a thing to be eliminated, but a thing to be read. The symptom is the unconscious speaking the only way it can, through the body, through the mood, through the behavior that does not make sense to the ego because the ego has closed every other channel. The insomnia is a message. The panic attack is a message. The obsessive thought is a message. Each one is the unconscious trying to deliver something the conscious mind has refused to receive through normal channels. Jung did not ask what is wrong with this person. He asked what is the psyche trying to say. The difference is enormous, because the first question treats the symptom as an enemy, and the second treats it as a messenger. And the messenger, listened to, often quiets on its own. Think of a symptom you carry and ask what it might be trying to tell you, what part of your life it is protesting, what need it is expressing through the only channel available. You do not need to listen tonight. Let the symptom rest, carrying its message, and know that Jung saw every psychological symptom as a letter from the unconscious, written in code because the conscious mind refused the plain version, and that the suffering is not the message itself, but the refusal to read it. The neurosis that protects and traps. The neurosis that protects and traps is Jung's understanding of why we develop patterns that cause us pain, but that we cannot stop repeating. Because the pattern was originally a solution, a way of surviving something that threatened us, and the solution, having once saved us, became permanent, continuing to operate long after the threat has passed. The child who learned to be invisible to avoid punishment carries the invisibility into adulthood, where it becomes loneliness. the person who learned to control everything to survive. Chaos continues to control everything in safety, where it becomes rigidity. The neurosis was a brilliant adaptation. It worked. And now it has become a cage, because the psyche, having found a solution that once saved its life, does not easily let it go, even when the solution is now the problem. Think of a pattern in your life that protects and traps at the same time. A behavior that once served you and now costs you, and how impossible it feels to stop doing the thing that used to save you. You do not need to escape any pattern tonight. Let the neurosis rest, carrying its dual nature, protector and prison, and know that Jung saw the neurotic pattern with compassion as a survival strategy that outlived its usefulness, a cage built by a younger you for very good reasons, and that the door, when you are ready, opens from the inside. The tension between who and who. The tension between who you are and who you think you should be is one of the quietest and most persistent sources of suffering, because the gap between the actual self and the ideal self produces a friction that never stops. Jung saw this tension as the conflict between the ego's constructed identity and the deeper, fuller self that the ego has edited, trimmed, and shaped into something presentable. The ideal self is not a goal. It is a prison, a standard built from expectations, comparisons, and shame. And the actual self, measured against it, always falls short, generating a suffering that looks like low self-worth, but is really the pain of self-division. The person suffering from this tension is not failing to be good enough. They are succeeding at a comparison that should never have been set up. Think of the version of yourself you believe you should be, and how the gap between that version and the person you actually are produces a constant, low-level disappointment, a quiet hum of inadequacy that colors everything without ever being loud enough to address directly. You do not need to close any gap tonight. Let the tension rest, and know that Jung saw the ideal self not as a destination, but as a distortion, a map drawn by other people's expectations, and that the suffering it produces is the suffering of measuring a real person against an imaginary one. A contest the real person can never win. The self you built against yourself. The self you built against yourself is the identity you constructed by rejecting parts of your own nature. The personality shaped not by what you included, but by what you excluded. And the exclusions, over time, became the architecture of your suffering. Every time you decided you could not be angry, or needy, or ambitious, or soft, you were not just making a choice. You were cutting off a part of yourself and building the remaining structure around the absence. The result is a self that is stable but incomplete, functional but quietly in pain, because the missing pieces are not truly missing. They are in the shadow, pressing against the structure from below, creating stress at the seams. Jung saw this as the fundamental source of neurotic suffering, the self at war with its own excluded parts, spending enormous energy keeping out the very things that would make it whole. Think of the parts of yourself you have excluded, the qualities you decided were unacceptable, and how the structure of your personality was built by excluding them, and how the exclusions are not empty spaces but pressures. You do not need to rebuild anything tonight. Let the structure rest, carrying its exclusions, and know that Jung saw the self you built as both your greatest achievement and your greatest wound, a personality assembled by cutting away everything that did not fit, and that the suffering is the quiet, persistent protest of the parts that were cut. The feeling you are not allowed to have. The feeling you are not allowed to have is the emotion that your upbringing, your culture, or your own ego has declared forbidden, and that continues to exist in the unconscious with all its original force, generating suffering precisely because it has been denied expression. Men who are not allowed to be sad, women who are not allowed to be angry, children who are not allowed to be afraid. The feeling does not vanish because it is forbidden. It goes underground, where it expresses itself indirectly, through symptoms, through moods, through the mysterious suffering that has no visible cause. Jung saw forbidden feelings as one of the primary building materials of the shadow, the reservoir of everything the ego cannot accept, and the suffering they produce is the suffering of containment, the pressure of a feeling that needs to move but has been locked in place. Think of the feeling you are least allowed to have, the one that would most threaten your identity if you expressed it, and consider that it is there, fully intact, pressing against the walls of its confinement. You do not need to feel anything forbidden tonight. Let the feeling rest, locked but alive, and know that the suffering it produces is not the feeling itself, but the locking, the daily expenditure of energy required to keep something natural in an unnatural cage. The thought you keep pushing down. The thought you keep pushing down is the idea, the realization, or the truth that keeps surfacing in your mind and that you keep pushing back below the waterline, because allowing it to stay would require changes you are not ready to make. Jung called this repression, and he understood it as one of the most energy-expensive operations the psyche performs, because the thought, once formed, does not disappear when pushed down. It returns. It returns at night. It returns in quiet moments. It returns with increasing force the more you push it away, because the psyche does not forget what it has seen, even when the ego demands amnesia. The suffering of the push-down thought is the suffering of knowing and refusing to know at the same time, of holding a truth underwater and feeling it push back against your hands. Think of the thought you keep pushing down, the one that returns every time you stop being busy enough to outrun it, and how exhausting the pushing has become, and how the thought, despite everything, keeps coming back. You do not need to let any thought surface tonight. Let it rest, pressed down and patient, and know that Jung saw the returning thought not as a persecutor, but as a truth teller, a part of the mind that refuses to let you live in a lie, and that the suffering of the pushing is the price of resisting something the psyche has already decided you need to see. The body that holds what you will not. The body that holds what you will not is Jung's understanding that psychological suffering, when denied expression through consciousness, will often express itself through the body instead, as pain, tension, illness, and the mysterious physical symptoms that have no medical explanation. The body is not separate from the psyche. It is the psyche's most literal voice, and when the mind refuses to feel what needs to be felt, the body takes over, carrying the unexpressed emotion in its muscles, its organs, its posture, and its pain. Jung observed that patients who could not cry developed migraines. Patients who could not express anger developed stomach problems. The body was speaking the language the mind refused to use. Think of where you carry tension in your body, the tight jaw, the locked shoulders, the knot in the stomach, and consider that the tension may not be physical in origin, but psychological. The body holding what the mind will not acknowledge. You do not need to release anything tonight. Let the body rest, carrying its stored feelings, and know that Jung saw the body's symptoms as the unconscious's most desperate communication channel, the one it uses when all others have been blocked, and that the physical pain you cannot explain may be the emotional pain you cannot afford to feel, expressed through the only voice left. The opposite that lives inside you. The opposite that lives inside you is Jung's principle of enantiodromia, the idea that every extreme position in the psyche secretly contains and eventually produces its opposite. The person who insists on being only strong is building, in the shadow, a devastating weakness. The person who demands only happiness is accumulating, below the surface, a corresponding despair. The more rigidly you hold one side, the more powerfully the other side grows in the unconscious, until the reversal comes, sudden and overwhelming, the controlled person exploding, the optimist crashing into depression, the caretaker collapsing into need. Jung saw this not as failure, but as the psyche's self-correcting mechanism, the way it forces balance on a system that has become too one-sided. The suffering comes from the one-sidedness itself, and from the reversal, which feels like betrayal but is actually correction. Think of a time your strongest quality suddenly reversed, when your patience became rage, your independence became isolation, your strength became collapse, and how the reversal felt like something breaking when it was actually something rebalancing. You do not need to balance anything tonight. Let the opposites rest side by side, and know that Jung saw every extreme as a setup for its own reversal, and that the suffering of the swing is the suffering of a psyche that has been pushed too far in one direction and is correcting itself forcefully because the gentler corrections were refused. The conflict that no one else can see. The conflict that no one else can see is the private war that produces your most visible suffering, but remains entirely invisible to the people around you, because it is happening inside, between parts of yourself that no one else can access. You look fine, you function, you perform your role. And inside, the war continues, the ego and the shadow, the persona and the real self, the conscious purpose and the unconscious need, pulling in opposite directions with a force that you absorb silently, alone, without anyone around you understanding why you are so tired, so sad, or so lost. Jung understood that the most painful suffering is often the most invisible, because the conflict is internal, and the person, trained by the persona to show only the acceptable surface, hides the war behind a face that says, everything is fine. Think of how alone your suffering has felt, how invisible the inner conflict has been to the people who think they know you, and how the invisibility itself added a layer of isolation to the pain. You do not need to show anyone anything tonight. Let the invisible conflict rest, as it rests when you sleep, and know that Jung saw the hidden war as one of the most common and most painful forms of human suffering, and that the loneliness of fighting a battle no one else can see is not a sign of your weakness, but a measure of how completely the inner life can be concealed by a person who has learned too well to hide. The truce you have not yet offered. The truce you have not yet offered is what this tear has been leading toward. The possibility that the war inside you can end, not through victory, but through dialogue, not through the ego conquering the unconscious, but through the ego learning to listen. Jung did not believe in destroying the shadow or silencing the unconscious. He believed in integration, in bringing the warring parts into conversation, in finding a relationship between the ego and the depths that is not dominance, but cooperation. The truce is not a surrender. It is a recognition that both sides have legitimate needs, that the ego's need for structure and the unconscious's need for expression are both valid, and that the suffering comes not from either need, but from the refusal to honor both. Think of what it would feel like to stop fighting yourself, to let the parts that have been at war simply coexist, and how the ceasefire, even imagined, produces a relief that years of fighting never did. You do not need to offer any truce tonight. Let the war rest, as it always rests in sleep, and know that the truce Jung envisioned is not a destination but a practice, a daily choosing to listen rather than suppress, to include rather than exile, and that the peace it produces is not the peace of silence, but the peace of a self that has finally, after years of civil war, agreed to let all of its parts exist in the same room. The life you did not live hurts most. The life you did not live hurts most, and Jung considered this one of the deepest truths about human suffering. The pain that comes from what happened to you, the losses, the failures, the wounds, is real and sharp, but it fades. The pain that comes from what did not happen, from the life you could have lived and did not, from the person you could have been and never became, does not fade. It grows. It grows because the unlived life does not sit quietly in the past. It lives in the unconscious, a potential that was never realized, a seed that was never planted, and the psyche treats it not as something that did not happen, but as something that should have happened and was denied. The denial becomes a pressure. The pressure becomes a suffering, and the suffering, because it has no specific event to point at, has no natural resolution. There is no grief process for something that never existed. There is only the ache of an absence that the person cannot name and cannot mourn. Think of the life you did not live, the one that flickers in your imagination late at night, the person you sense you were supposed to be, and how the pain of that unlived possibility is different from any pain you can explain, quieter, deeper, and harder to treat, because there is no wound to point at, only a space where something should have grown. You do not need to live any unlived life tonight. Let the ache rest, carrying its nameless grief, and know that Jung saw this as the most important suffering a person can face, because it points not at the past, but at the future, not at what was lost, but at what still might, if you are brave enough, be found. The person you were supposed to be. The person you were supposed to be is the version of yourself that your deepest nature was always trying to produce. The person you would have become if the world had not intervened with its demands, its expectations, and its relentless pressure to be something other than what you are. Jung called this the process of individuation, the psyche's natural drive toward its own fullest expression. And he believed that interference with this process, whether by family, culture, or the person's own fear, is the primary cause of psychological suffering. The person you were supposed to be is not an ideal. It is not a perfect version of you. It is the real version, the unedited one, the version that includes the shadow and the gold and the mess and the beauty, and the fact that it was not allowed to develop fully is the fact that hurts. Think of the gap between who you are and who you sense you were meant to be, not the ideal version from a self-help book, but the real, specific, complicated person your nature was trying to create, and how the gap produces a pain that no achievement in the world you built instead can fill. You do not need to become anyone tonight. Let the person you were supposed to be rest in the depths, patient and unfinished, and know that Jung saw this potential self not as lost, but as waiting, not as a reproach, but as a destination, and that the pain of not having arrived is not the end of the journey, but the evidence that the journey has not yet been taken. The talent you buried alive. The talent you buried alive is the ability, the gift, the capacity that you had and did not develop, not because you lacked it, but because you were taught it was impractical, or because the environment did not support it, or because you were afraid of what it would ask of you. The talent did not die when you stopped using it. It went underground, into the unconscious, where it continues to live, and its continued life in the dark is part of what produces the nameless ache you carry, because the psyche knows what it contains, even when the ego pretends it does not. Jung saw buried potential as one of the most toxic contents of the unconscious, not because talent is dangerous, but because denied talent generates resentment, bitterness, and a quiet rage that has nowhere to go. Think of the thing you were good at and set down, the ability that was real and that you let atrophy, and how the setting down was not a clean break, but an ongoing burial. The talent still alive, still pressing upward, still asking to be used. You do not need to unearth anything tonight. Let the buried talent rest as it has rested, alive and unused, and know that Jung saw the denial of real capacity as one of the cruelest things a person can do to themselves, and that the pain of the burial is not the talent's revenge, but its voice, still calling, still asking, after all these years, to be let out. The voice you silenced for safety. The voice you silenced for safety is the part of yourself that wanted to speak, to express, to be heard, and that you shut down because speaking up felt too dangerous, too vulnerable, or too likely to cost you the acceptance you needed. The silencing was rational. It may have been necessary. In an environment where speaking your truth would have been punished, staying silent was survival. But Jung understood that the voice you silence does not disappear. It goes into the shadow, and from there it produces a suffering that is the exact shape of the words you did not say. A silent-shaped pain that lives in the throat, in the chest, in the place where expression was stopped. The silenced voice becomes rage in some people, depression in others, and in many, a chronic, low-level pain of inauthenticity that no amount of safety can compensate for. Think of the thing you most needed to say and did not, and how the not saying became a permanent feature of your inner landscape, a silence that is louder, in its way, than any word could be. You do not need to speak tonight. Let the silence hold its shape, and know that Jung saw every silenced voice as a debt the psyche would eventually collect, and that the pain of not speaking, while quieter than the pain of speaking up, accumulates interest over time, growing heavier with every year. The truth remains unsaid. The dream you gave up on too soon. The dream you gave up on too soon is the vision of your life that you abandoned, not because it was wrong, but because it was hard. And the abandonment, which felt like maturity at the time, was actually a kind of self-betrayal that the psyche has never forgiven. Jung distinguished between foolish dreams, which are the ego's fantasies of grandeur, and authentic dreams, which are expressions of the self's genuine direction, and he believed that abandoning an authentic dream is one of the most damaging things a person can do to their own wholeness. The authentic dream is not about success. It is about alignment, about living in a way that matches what the deepest part of you needs to express. And when that alignment is abandoned for practical reasons, the practicality may save your circumstances, but it wounds your soul. Think of the dream you gave up and the reason you gave, and how reasonable the reason sounded, and how the reasonableness did not stop the ache. You do not need to chase any dream tonight. Let it rest, given up and still glowing, and know that Jung saw the abandoned authentic dream as one of the primary sources of midlife suffering. The thing that returns, 20 years later, asking why. And the pain of the asking is the pain of a self that remembers what it was supposed to be, even when the person has worked very hard to forget. The risk you traded for comfort. The risk you traded for comfort is the moment you chose the safe path over the meaningful one, and the comfort you gained came at a price the conscious mind did not calculate, because the price was not paid in circumstances, but in aliveness. Jung observed that many people trade vitality for security, choosing the predictable life over the authentic one, and that the security, once achieved, produces not peace, but a quiet deadening, a reduction in the feeling of being alive that no amount of material comfort can restore. The risk was not about recklessness. It was about growth, about moving toward the thing that frightened you, and that the deeper self knew you needed. The comfort was real. The deadening was real too. And the suffering of the deadened life is the suffering of a person who is safe and somehow less alive than they were when they were at risk. Think of the moment you chose comfort over risk, and how the comfort arrived and the aliveness diminished, and how the trade, which seemed wise, left you with a life that is stable and slightly gray. You do not need to take any risk tonight. Let the comfort hold you, as it holds you, and know that Jung saw the choice between comfort and aliveness as one of the great forks of the human journey, and that the suffering of the comfortable is not ingratitude, but the honest protest of a self that was built for more than survival. The passion you called impractical. The passion you called impractical is the thing that lit you up, the activity or pursuit that made you feel most alive, most yourself, most engaged with something real, and that you dismissed because it did not fit the practical requirements of the life you were building. The dismissal made sense. The passion did not pay. The passion did not produce results the world could measure. And so you set it aside. And the setting aside was so quiet and so reasonable that you barely noticed the light going out. Jung saw passion not as a luxury, but as a signal from the self, an indicator of the direction the psyche needed to grow, and the dismissal of passion as the dismissal of the signal, the ego overriding the self's navigation system because the ego's map looked different. The passion was not impractical. It was essential in the deepest sense, and the suffering that followed its dismissal is the suffering of a person navigating without the instrument they most need. Think of the thing you loved that you called impractical, and how the word practical, used as a weapon against your own aliveness, was the most expensive word you ever spoke. You do not need to be practical tonight. Let the passion rest, dismissed and still glowing, and know that Jung saw the practical life built on the grave of passion as one of the most common and most painful forms of self-betrayal, quiet, reasonable, and devastating. The wildness you tamed too well. The wildness you tamed too well is the instinctual, undomesticated, raw part of yourself that you civilized out of existence because the world demanded a version of you that was controlled, predictable, and safe. Jung believed that every person carries a wild core, an instinctual energy that is the source of creativity, vitality, and genuine life force, and that the process of socialization, while necessary, often goes too far, taming not just the destructive impulses, but the creative ones as well. The person who has been tamed too well is polite, productive, and secretly dying inside, because the energy that makes a person feel alive is the energy that was taken from them in the name of civilization. Think of the wildness you used to carry, the version of you that was less controlled and more alive, and how the taming, however necessary, took something from you that the tamed version cannot access. The wildness was not chaos. It was energy, raw and unrefined, and without it, the refined self runs on a diminished supply. You do not need to be wild tonight. Let the tamed self rest, carrying its good manners and its quiet loss. And know that Jung saw the overtamed psyche as one of the most common casualties of civilization. A person who traded their fire for their seat at the table, and who sits now, warm and fed, wondering why everything feels so cold. The love you did not let yourself feel. The love you did not let yourself feel is the emotion that was available to you and that you blocked, because feeling it would have required a vulnerability you could not afford, and the blocking, which protected you from the risk of love, also cut you off from the nourishment of it. Jung understood that love, in its deepest sense, is not a choice, but a movement of the psyche, and that blocking it requires a constant, draining effort that produces a suffering very different from the suffering of lost love. The person who loved and lost knows their pain. The person who never let themselves love does not know theirs, because the pain is the shape of something that was never allowed to exist. Think of a love you held back, a feeling you did not let yourself fully enter, and how the holding back was a kind of loss that cannot be grieved because it was never acknowledged. You do not need to feel any love tonight. Let the unloved love rest, blocked and still present, and know that Jung saw the refusal of love as one of the deepest forms of self-harm, because love is one of the primary movements of the self, and the blocking of it does not keep you safe. It keeps you starving. In a room full of food, you will not let yourself eat. The anger you never let out. The anger you never let out is the emotion that had every right to exist, and that you swallowed, buried, and converted into something more acceptable, because you were taught that anger is dangerous, or because expressing it would have cost you something you could not afford to lose. Jung saw suppressed anger as one of the most common and most destructive contents of the shadow, not because anger is inherently destructive, but because anger denied its natural expression becomes toxic, turning inward as depression, outward as passive aggression, or sideways as chronic resentment that poisons relationships without ever announcing itself as what it is. The anger you never let out is still in you, fully preserved, waiting in the shadow with the same force it had on the day you swallowed it. And the swallowing did not neutralize it. It stored it, under pressure, in a container that was never meant to hold it. Think of the anger you carry that you have never expressed, and how heavy it has become, and how the weight of it colors everything without anyone knowing it is there. You do not need to express any anger tonight. Let it rest, swallowed and heavy, and know that Jung saw the unexpressed anger not as a virtue of self-control, but as a debt of emotional honesty, and that the anger itself is not the problem. The suppression is the problem, and the suppression is where the suffering lives. The joy you were afraid to show. The joy you were afraid to show is the happiness that you held back, because showing it felt unsafe, because being visibly happy invited punishment, jealousy, or the fear that the happiness would be taken away. Jung noted that joy, surprisingly, can be as deeply suppressed as anger, and for similar reasons, because the environment taught you that visible happiness was dangerous, that standing in your joy would attract attention you did not want, and that the safest strategy was to dampen the light so no one would notice and try to extinguish it. The suppressed joy becomes a specific kind of suffering, the ache of a person who can feel happiness but cannot show it, who has learned to hide the best part of their experience as carefully as they hide the worst. Think of a time you were genuinely happy and hid it, dimmed it, downplayed it, and how the hiding became a habit, and the habit became a prison. And the prison became so familiar you forgot you were in it. You do not need to show any joy tonight. Let it rest, hidden and real, and know that Jung saw the suppression of joy as just as damaging as the suppression of darkness. Because a person who cannot show their happiness is a person who has been taught that their light is as dangerous as their shadow, and the teaching, however well intended, produces a life lived at half brightness. The self that starved in silence. The self that starved in silence is the cumulative result of everything this tier has described: the talent buried, the voice silenced, the dream abandoned, the passion dismissed, the wildness tamed, the love blocked, the anger swallowed, the joy hidden. All of them parts of the authentic self that were denied expression, and that, denied, did not die, but starved, growing thinner and quieter in the darkness, while the persona, the constructed self, grew thicker and louder on the surface. Jung saw the starving of the authentic self as the central tragedy of most human lives, not because people are cruel to themselves, but because the world does not make it safe to be whole, and the self that is not safe to express learns, eventually, to stop asking. The starvation is silent because the starving self has lost its voice, buried so deep that even the person carrying it may not know it is there. Think of the parts of yourself that went quiet over the years, the ones that stopped asking to be fed, and how their silence was not acceptance, but exhaustion. You do not need to feed anything tonight. Let the starving self rest, quiet and still present, and know that Jung spent his life trying to reach this silent place in people, believing that the self that starved could be nourished again, that the parts that went quiet could speak again, and that the most important work a person can do is to go back to the place where the self went silent and listen. The unlived life demands a reckoning. The unlived life demands a reckoning. And Jung saw this reckoning as the most important crisis a person can face, because it is the moment when the accumulated weight of everything unlived, every denied talent, every silenced voice, every abandoned dream, finally becomes too heavy to carry, and the psyche insists that something must change. The reckoning often arrives at midlife, but it can come at any age, and it comes not as an idea, but as a feeling, a collapse, a depression, a crisis that no external adjustment can fix, because the crisis is not about what is happening, but about what has never been allowed to happen. The reckoning is the unlived life, refusing to stay unlived any longer, pressing upward with a force that the ego can no longer contain. Think of the moments in your life when something inside you demanded a change you were not ready for, and how the demand felt like a breaking, but was actually a becoming. The accumulated potential insisting on its right to exist. You do not need to face any reckoning tonight. Let it rest, approaching or past or not yet arrived, and know that Jung saw this crisis as the most hopeful moment in a person's life, because it means the unlived life is still alive, still pressing, still demanding its turn, and that the suffering of the reckoning is not the end of something, but the beginning, the painful, necessary birth of a self that was always there, waiting beneath the life that was lived instead, for the courage that would finally let it through. The complex that runs your life. The complex that runs your life is a term Jung invented to describe the clusters of emotion, memory, and behavior that form around a wound and then operate autonomously, running your reactions without your permission. A complex is not just a memory, it is a living system within the psyche, a knot of feeling tied to a core experience. And when the knot is touched, the complex takes over, hijacking your mood, your judgment, and your behavior in ways the ego cannot control. You say something you do not mean. You react with an intensity that does not match the situation. You feel like a different person for a few minutes because you are, briefly, possessed by the complex rather than by your conscious self. Jung described complexes as splinter psyches, autonomous fragments of the personality that have their own emotional logic and their own agenda. Think of a pattern in your life where you lose yourself, where a feeling takes over so completely that you look back and wonder who was driving, and consider that the answer is the complex, a wound so deep it developed its own personality and its own behavior, and that the person you become in those moments is not your worst self, but your oldest wound, running the show from below. You do not need to identify any complex tonight. Let it rest in the dark, running quietly, as it always does, and know that Jung saw the complex not as a weakness, but as a wound that learned to walk, a piece of the psyche that split off from the whole and is now living its own small, autonomous, painful life inside yours. The wound that never finished healing. The wound that never finished healing is the injury from your past that you thought you dealt with, that you told yourself was over, that you believed you had processed and moved beyond, and that continues, despite everything, to bleed into the present. Jung understood that psychological wounds do not heal the way physical ones do, because the psyche does not forget. And a wound that was never fully faced, never fully felt, never fully integrated, remains open in the unconscious, responding to any contact with the same pain it carried on the day it was made. The wound was not healed. It was covered, walled off, buried under the daily business of getting on with life, and the covering was mistaken for healing. But covering is not healing. It is storage. And the stored wound, activated by anything that resembles the original injury, produces the same fresh pain in a person who thought they were past it. Think of a wound you thought was healed, and the moment it opened again, unexpectedly, in response to something small, and how the pain was not diminished but perfectly preserved, as though no time had passed at all. You do not need to heal anything tonight. Let the wound rest, open and covered, and still there, and know that Jung saw the unhealed wound not as a failure, but as an invitation. The psyche pointing at the place that still needs attention, the place where the healing was started but never finished, waiting patiently for the courage to go back and complete what was left undone. The pattern you keep repeating. The pattern you keep repeating is the cycle you recognize, the situation you find yourself in again and again. The same kind of relationship, the same kind of failure, the same kind of pain, arriving in different costumes but following the same script. And the repetition, which seems like bad luck, is actually the complex at work, drawing you back to the unresolved wound and staging the same drama, hoping that this time you will see it, this time you will respond differently, this time the old story will finally get a new ending. Jung saw repetition compulsion as the psyche's attempt to heal itself, a crude but determined strategy of recreating the original wound in new contexts, giving the person another chance to face what they could not face the first time. The strategy almost never works because the person, caught inside the pattern, does not recognize it as a repetition. They think it is new. They think this relationship is different, this situation is different, this time is different, and it is not. Think of the pattern in your life that keeps returning, the one you recognize with a sinking feeling, and how the recognizing never seems to be enough to stop the next round. You do not need to break any pattern tonight. Let the repetition rest, carrying its unbroken loop, and know that Jung saw the pattern not as your fate, but as your psyche's clumsy, persistent, ultimately hopeful attempt to bring you back to the wound again and again, until you finally stop repeating and start understanding. The parent whose voice you still hear. The parent whose voice you still hear is the internalized version of a parent that lives inside your psyche, long after the actual parent has lost the power to shape you, and that continues to speak with an authority the real parent no longer has. Jung understood that our earliest relationships do not simply influence us. They install themselves in the unconscious as inner figures, complexes that carry the parent's voice, tone, judgments, and expectations, and that continue to operate independently, long after the child has become an adult. The critical parent becomes an inner critic. The anxious parent becomes an inner voice of fear. The absent parent becomes an inner void of unworthiness. The installation happened before the child could evaluate it, which is why the voice carries such authority. It was absorbed whole, without the filter of adult judgment, and it operates from a pre-rational place that rational counterarguments cannot easily reach. Think of the voice inside you that judges, warns, shames, or demands, and how the voice sounds like someone you know, and how the knowing does not give you power over it, because the voice was installed before you had the tools to question it. You do not need to silence any voice tonight. Let it speak or rest as it will, and know that Jung saw the inner parent not as the real parent, but as a complex and autonomous figure in the psyche that carries the parent's legacy, and that can, with enough work, be met, understood, and gently, slowly, brought into a relationship with the adult self that was never the child who first heard it. The rejection that shaped everything. The rejection that shaped everything is the specific moment or period when you were excluded, refused, or told you were not wanted. And the experience, rather than passing, installed itself as a permanent filter through which you see every subsequent relationship. Jung saw early rejection as one of the most powerful, complex forming experiences, because the child's psyche, which depends entirely on acceptance for survival, interprets rejection not as information about the rejector, but as truth about the self. I was rejected because I am rejectable. The conclusion is wrong, formed by a mind too young to see the full picture, but its wrongness does not weaken its power. The complex operates from this early, false conclusion, scanning every new relationship for signs of the rejection it expects, and finding them, or creating them, because a complex does not just respond to reality, it shapes it. Think of how the rejection you experienced early on still lives in the way you approach closeness, how you brace for the refusal before it arrives, how you sometimes reject first to avoid being rejected, and how the pattern, in its desperate self-protection, creates exactly the outcome it is trying to prevent. You do not need to face any rejection tonight. Let the early wound rest, carrying its false conclusion, and know that Jung saw the rejection complex as one of the most painful and most treatable, because the conclusion at its core is wrong. And once the wrongness is seen, truly seen, from the perspective of an adult rather than a child, the complex begins, slowly, to loosen its grip. The moment you learned you were not enough. The moment you learned you were not enough is the specific experience, often so early you cannot consciously remember it, when the message arrived, through words or through silence, through what was done or through what was not done, that you, as you were insufficient. The message may not have been spoken. It may have been the expression on a face, the withdrawal of warmth, the consistent praise of a sibling, the implicit communication that you needed to be different in order to be loved. Jung saw this moment as the birth of a core complex, the not enough wound, one of the most common and most destructive patterns in the human psyche. The wound does not produce a memory you can argue with. It produces a feeling, a bodily certainty that you are lacking, and the feeling operates below the level of rational thought, immune to every achievement, every compliment, every piece of evidence that you are, in fact, enough. Think of how deep the not enough feeling goes, how it survives every success, every validation, every proof that it is wrong, and how its survival points to its origin, a place so early and so deep that evidence cannot reach it. You do not need to prove anything tonight. Let the feeling rest, ancient and false and powerful, and know that Jung saw the not enough wound as a complex, not a truth, a feeling installed before you could evaluate it, and that the feeling, however real, is based on a conclusion made by a child who did not have the capacity to know that the message was about the messenger, not about them. The love that came with conditions. The love that came with conditions is the early experience of being loved, not for who you are, but for what you do, how you perform, how well you meet expectations. And the suffering it produces is one of the most pervasive and most invisible in human life. Jung saw conditional love as the primary mechanism by which the shadow is created, because the child, receiving the message that some parts of them are lovable and others are not, begins the lifelong project of performing the lovable parts and hiding the rest. The construction of the persona, the development of the shadow, the suppression of the authentic self, all begin here, in the early discovery that love has terms and conditions. The suffering is not that you were unloved. You may have been loved enormously, but the love had a shape, and you had to fit it. And the parts that did not fit were sent to the shadow, where they remain, generating the nameless ache of a person who is loved for their performance and starving for acceptance of who they actually are. Think of the conditions you learned to meet in order to be loved, and how meeting them became automatic, and how the automation became a prison. You do not need to earn any love tonight. Let the conditions rest, and know that Jung saw the conditional love wound as the origin of the divided self, the moment when a whole person began to split into acceptable and unacceptable, and the split, which began as survival, became the architecture of a lifetime of suffering. The role you were given too young, is the adult responsibility that was placed on a child who was not ready for it. The parentified child who became the caretaker, the mediator, the emotional anchor of a family that needed them to be more than a child should be. Jung understood that premature responsibility does not produce maturity. It produces a specific kind of complex, a false adult built over an unlived childhood, and the person carrying this complex functions well on the surface, is capable, is reliable, is the one everyone depends on. While underneath, the child who never got to be a child aches with a need that the adult role permanently defers. The role was not chosen. It was imposed by circumstances, by a parent who could not cope, by a family that needed someone to hold it together, and the child who needed to be held became the one doing the holding. Think of the role you played too early, and how the competence it built is real, and how the ache beneath it is equally real, and how the two coexist in a person who looks strong because they had no choice. You do not need to hold anything together tonight. Let the role rest, carrying its competence and its cost, and know that Jung saw the too early role as a wound disguised as a gift. The child who is praised for being grown up when they should have been allowed to be small, and the suffering is the unlived smallness, the childhood that was spent in service, and the child who, even now, is still waiting for their turn. The punishment that became your voice. The punishment that became your voice is the internalized criticism, the harsh words, the consequences you received as a child that did not stay external but moved inside and became the voice that punishes you now from within, with the same tone and the same words, long after the original punisher has stopped. Jung saw the inner critic as a complex formed from early punishment, a voice so well rehearsed that the person no longer needs anyone external to deliver it. The criticism has been automated, the punishment has been internalized, and the most painful part is that the voice sounds like your own, which makes it almost impossible to recognize as an import rather than a truth. You believe the voice is right because it lives inside you, and things that live inside feel like they belong there. But this voice was installed, not grown. It was built from someone else's harshness and placed in a child who did not have the tools to reject it. Think of the voice that punishes you from the inside, and how it sounds like your own judgment, and how confidently it speaks, and how the confidence is borrowed from a person who once had power over you. You do not need to silence the voice tonight. Let it rest, as it sometimes does in the quiet before sleep. And know that Jung saw this voice as a complex, not a conscience, a piece of someone else's harshness living inside you under a false name, and that recognizing it as foreign, as installed rather than innate, is the first step toward turning down its volume. The abandonment that still decides. The abandonment that still decides is the early experience of being left, physically or emotionally, that installed a pattern of preemptive self-protection so deep it still governs your relationships, your trust, and your ability to let people close. Jung saw the abandonment wound as one of the most powerful complexes because the experience of being left activates the most primal fear the human psyche contains, the fear of annihilation through isolation, and the defense the child builds against this fear, never let anyone close enough to leave you, becomes a permanent feature of the adult personality. The defense works. No one can leave you if you never let them arrive. But the cost is a life lived behind glass, visible to others, but untouchable by them, safe from abandonment, and also safe from genuine closeness. Think of how you manage distance in your relationships, how the wall goes up before anyone gets too close, how the leaving is always anticipated, even in the safest arms, and how the anticipation itself creates the distance it was trying to prevent. You do not need to let anyone in tonight. Let the wall stand, as it has always stood, carrying its protective work, and know that Jung saw the abandonment complex as one of the most tragic, because the person it protects is also the person it isolates, and the safety it provides is the safety of a cell, effective and empty, keeping the feared thing out and the needed thing out as well. The protection that became the wound. The protection that became the wound is the defense mechanism that was built to save you, and that, over time, became the very thing causing your pain. The child who learned to be invisible to survive now suffers from being unseen. The child who learned to be perfect to earn love now suffers from the impossibility of perfection. The child who learned to need nothing now suffers from a starvation they cannot name. Every defense that saved you in childhood saved you by cutting off a part of your nature, and the cutting, which was necessary then, is unnecessary now. But the defense does not know this, because defenses do not update themselves. They continue to operate on the original threat assessment, protecting you from a danger that has long since passed, at a cost that has long since exceeded the benefit. Think of your most automatic defense, the thing you do without thinking in moments of vulnerability, and consider that the defense, however protective, is also the thing keeping you from the very experience you most need. You do not need to lower any defense tonight. Let the protection rest, carrying its outdated mission. And know that Jung saw this as one of the most compassionate truths about suffering, that the thing hurting you most was built by a child who was trying to survive, and that the child did their best, and the best was brilliant. And the brilliant thing that saved you then is the very thing you now need, gently and with enormous gratitude, to outgrow. The prison you built from the hurt. The prison you built from the hurt is the whole of this tear gathered into a single, quiet recognition that the wounds of your past did not only damage you, they built you, and the building, which was a survival strategy, became the structure you now live inside. A personality shaped by pain, a set of walls built from injuries, a self assembled from the need to never be hurt that way again. Jung saw this not with judgment, but with compassion, because the prison was not built by a fool or a coward. It was built by a child in crisis, working with the only materials available, which were the materials of the wound itself. The walls are real. They are strong. They have kept you safe for decades. And they are a prison, because a wall that keeps danger out also keeps life out. And the person living inside, however safe, is also trapped, surrounded by their own defenses, unable to reach the world without climbing the walls they built to protect themselves from it. You do not need to escape tonight. Let the prison rest, solid and familiar, its walls built from every wound that ever hurt you, and know that Jung saw the prison with tenderness, as the most understandable structure in the world, built by a person who was hurt and who did what they could, and that the door, when you are ready, has always opened from the inside, because the builder and the prisoner have always been the same person, and the one who locked it is the one who holds the key. You carry what is not yours. You carry what is not yours. And Jung believed this is one of the most overlooked sources of human suffering. The pain that was never generated by your own experience, but was placed in you by someone else and carried as though it were your own. Projection is not only something you do to others, it is something others do to you, placing their shadow, their guilt, their unresolved emotion onto you, and you, often without realizing it, accept the deposit and carry it forward, suffering under a weight that was never yours to bear. Children are especially vulnerable to this because they do not have the capacity to distinguish between their own feelings and the feelings being placed in them. And by the time they develop that capacity, the foreign material has been installed so deeply it feels native. Think of a feeling you carry that has always felt slightly wrong, slightly too large for its apparent cause, and consider that the feeling may not be yours at all, that it may have been placed in you by someone who needed you to carry it, and that the suffering it produces is the suffering of a person bearing a burden they did not create and do not own. You do not need to sort the feelings tonight. Let them rest. Yours and not yours, mixed together. And know that Jung saw this as one of the most important discoveries a person can make, that some of the heaviest things you carry were never yours, and that the realization itself, when it comes, does not remove the weight, but changes your relationship to it. Because a burden you recognize as foreign is a burden you can eventually set down. The shadow someone placed on you. The shadow someone placed on you is the quality they could not accept in themselves and deposited onto you instead, making you the carrier of their disowned darkness. Jung described this as one of the most destructive forms of projection because the person doing the projecting is usually someone with power over you, a parent, a partner, an authority figure, and their projection, landing on you repeatedly, eventually becomes something you believe about yourself. The parent who could not accept their own selfishness sees selfishness in the child and punishes it. The partner who cannot face their own dishonesty accuses you of lying. The projection is not about you, it is about them. But the receiving of it, especially when you are young, shapes your self-concept in ways that outlast the projector's presence. Think of a quality you have been told you have, that you have been criticized for or shamed about, and ask whether the quality might belong not to you, but to the person who first named it in you. The accusation may have been their confession, disguised as your diagnosis. You do not need to return any shadow tonight. Let it rest, placed and heavy, and know that Jung saw this as one of the most liberating moments in therapy. The moment a person realizes that the darkness they have been carrying was never theirs, that it was placed in them by someone who could not carry it themselves, and that the shame they have been feeling is someone else's shame, wearing their name. The parent who lived through you. The parent who lived through you is the one who used your life as a vehicle for their unlived dreams, placing their unfulfilled ambitions, their unclaimed potential, their unresolved desires onto you and expecting you to live them out. Jung saw this as one of the most common and most damaging forms of parental projection, because the child, eager to please and unable to distinguish between their own desires and the parents', takes on the mission and lives a life shaped not by their own nature, but by someone else's unfinished business. The suffering comes later, when the person realizes that the achievements they pursued were not theirs, that the career they built was someone else's dream, and that the life they are living, however successful, belongs to the parent rather than to the person living it. Think of the ambition that drove you hardest and ask whose ambition it originally was. Whether the hunger you feel to achieve a particular thing is truly yours, or whether you inherited it from someone who needed you to finish what they could not. You do not need to sort any ambitions tonight. Let them rest, yours and borrowed. And know that Jung saw the unlived life of the parent as one of the heaviest things a child can carry, because it is invisible, because it looks like love, and because the child, carrying it willingly, does not know they are living someone else's life until the weight of it finally becomes unbearable. The family wound passed down. The family wound passed down is the pain that did not begin with you, but was transmitted across generations. A pattern of suffering that your parents inherited from their parents and passed to you, not through words, but through behavior, through tone, through the atmosphere of a home, shaped by a wound no one spoke about. Jung saw family patterns as a form of psychological inheritance, the unprocessed pain of one generation becoming the emotional climate of the next. Because what the parents cannot face consciously, they act out unconsciously, and the children, absorbing the atmosphere, take the wound into their own psyche without ever knowing its origin. The mother's unspoken grief becomes the daughter's unnamed sadness. The father's unprocessed rage becomes the son's unexplained anger. The wound travels, disguised as mood, as temperament, as just how things are, and each generation carries it a little further without understanding where it came from. Think of a feeling you carry that seems older than your own life, a heaviness, or a fear that does not match your experience, and consider that you may be carrying something that began before you were born. You do not need to trace any lineage tonight. Let the inherited wound rest, carrying its generational weight, and know that Jung saw the family wound as one of the most important things a person can become aware of, because awareness is what stops the transmission, and the generation that sees the wound clearly is the generation that can choose, finally, not to pass it on. The emotion you absorbed as a child. The emotion you absorbed as a child is the feeling that was in the air around you, that belonged to someone else but soaked into you, because children are sponges for the emotional atmosphere, unable to filter what they take in. The anxious parent produces an anxious child, not through genetics alone, but through exposure. The child's nervous system calibrating itself to the parent's emotional frequency, learning that the world is dangerous not through experience, but through absorption. Jung understood that children do not learn emotions. They catch them, the way bodies catch infections, through proximity, through the air, through the invisible transmission of feelings that the parent may not even know they are broadcasting. The emotion you absorbed was not yours. It was the weather in the room, and you, the smallest and most permeable person in it, were saturated before you could build a raincoat. Think of an emotion you carry that does not seem to belong to your experience, and ask whether it might have been in the room when you were too small to block it. You do not need to release any absorbed emotion tonight. Let it rest, soaked in and fully integrated. And know that Jung saw the child's absorption of parental emotion as one of the quietest and most powerful forms of psychological inheritance, happening without words, without awareness, and without consent. The child taking in what the parent put out and carrying it innocently as their own. The role that was someone else's need. The role that was someone else's need is the function you perform in your family or your relationships. Not because it serves you, but because someone else needs you to perform it. And the performing, which began as an act of love or survival, has become a source of suffering. Because the role does not match who you are. You are the strong one because someone needed you to be strong. You are the peacemaker because someone needed there to be peace. You are the quiet one because someone needed silence. The role was not assigned with malice. It was assigned by a system that needed a part filled, and you, the most available or the most willing, were cast in the part. Jung saw these assigned roles as a form of projection, the family or the relationship projecting its need onto the most receptive member, and the member absorbing the projection, becoming the role. Think of the role you play in your closest relationships and ask whether the role is yours or whether you are carrying it for someone else, performing a function the system needs rather than one your nature chose. You do not need to resign from any role tonight. Let it rest, carried and familiar, and know that Jung saw the assigned role as one of the most common sources of quiet suffering, because the person performing it is doubly burdened, carrying both the weight of the role and the weight of the self that was set aside to play it. The guilt that was given to you. The guilt that was given to you is the feeling of having done something wrong that was placed in you by someone who needed you to feel responsible for something that was not your fault. Jung saw this as a particularly destructive form of projection because guilt, once installed, operates with the full authority of the conscience, and a person carrying guilt they did not earn believes the guilt as completely as if they had genuinely done something wrong. Parents who make a child feel responsible for the parent's happiness. Partners who make you feel guilty for having needs. Systems that assign blame to the most vulnerable member. In each case, the guilt is a transfer, a deposit of responsibility from someone who cannot bear it to someone who cannot refuse it. And the suffering it produces is the suffering of a person serving a sentence for a crime they did not commit. Think of a guilt you carry and ask whether the thing you feel guilty about was truly your fault, or whether the guilt was placed in you by someone who needed you to feel responsible so they would not have to. You do not need to resolve any guilt tonight. Let it rest, heavy and possibly foreign, and know that Jung saw the distinction between authentic guilt, which comes from genuine wrongdoing, and projected guilt, which comes from someone else's need, as one of the most important distinctions a person can learn to make. The shame that belongs to another. The shame that belongs to another is the feeling of being fundamentally flawed that was transmitted to you by someone who carried the same feeling and could not bear it alone. Shame is one of the most contagious emotions, and Jung understood that shaming is almost always a projection. The person who shames you doing so because they carry a shame they cannot hold. And the transfer, which makes them feel temporarily lighter, makes you permanently heavier. The child who is shamed absorbs the message not as information but as identity. I am wrong, I am bad, I am defective. And the message, installed before the child could evaluate it, becomes a core belief that no amount of adult evidence can fully dislodge. Think of the shame you carry at the deepest level, the feeling that something about you is fundamentally wrong, and consider that the feeling may have been placed in you by someone who is carrying the same shame and could not bear to carry it alone. You do not need to release any shame tonight. Let it rest, ancient and possibly not yours. And know that Jung saw shame as one of the most transferred emotions in the human repertoire, passed from parent to child like a hot coal, not from cruelty, but from the unbearable need to put it somewhere. And that the first step toward freedom from carried shame is the recognition that it may never have been yours to begin with. The expectation that was never yours. The expectation that was never yours is the standard you hold yourself to that was installed by someone else, for their own reasons, and that you adopted so early you cannot remember a time before it governed you. Jung saw expectations as one of the primary vehicles through which the persona is built, each expectation adding a layer to the mask, shaping the person into what is expected rather than what is authentic. And the suffering comes from the impossible effort to meet a standard that was not designed for the person trying to meet it. The expectation may be reasonable for someone else. It is not reasonable for you because it was not built from your nature, but imposed upon it. Think of the expectation that weighs on you most heavily and ask whose voice first spoke it, whose approval it was designed to earn, and whether the standard, examined honestly, matches what your own nature actually needs. You do not need to meet any expectation tonight. Let it rest, carrying its impossible demand, and know that Jung saw the foreign expectation as one of the simplest and most painful sources of suffering, because the person trying to meet it is running a race they did not enter, toward a finish line someone else drew, on a course that was never designed for the body running it. The person who made you their mirror. The person who made you their mirror is the one who used you to see themselves, relating to you not as a separate person, but as a reflection of their own needs, desires, and self-image. Jung understood this as a narcissistic form of relating, where the other person does not see you at all, but sees only the version of you that serves their story. And any deviation from the reflection is experienced by them as betrayal. The suffering this produces is the suffering of being unseen, of existing in someone's life as a function rather than a person, of being loved, not for who you are, but for how accurately you mirror what they need to see. The child of such a parent learns that their worth depends on their usefulness as a mirror, and the learning produces a lifelong pattern of performing rather than being, of shaping yourself to reflect what others need rather than what you actually are. Think of a relationship in which you felt you existed only as a reflection of the other person, and how the absence of being truly seen produced a particular kind of loneliness that proximity could not cure. You do not need to be seen tonight. Let the mirror rest, and know that Jung saw the mirroring relationship as one of the most damaging, because the person used as a mirror loses not just their identity, but their sense that identity is even possible, believing that who they are is only ever what someone else needs them to be. The scapegoat who carried the family. The scapegoat who carried the family is the member who was assigned the role of holding the family's dysfunction, the one who was identified as the problem so that the rest of the system could remain comfortable. Jung saw scapegoating as a collective projection, the family or the group placing its shadow onto a single member and then treating that member as though the shadow belonged to them. The scapegoat carries the family's unacknowledged pain, its secret shame, its denied dysfunction. wearing it as their own identity while the rest of the system points at them and says, they are the problem. The scapegoat suffers not only from the projection but from the isolation, because the role, by definition, places them outside the group, and the exclusion is experienced as proof that the problem is indeed theirs. Think of whether you have ever been the one a group pointed at, the one who carried the blame the group could not face, and how the carrying felt like a personal failure when it was actually a systemic function. You do not need to carry anything for anyone tonight. Let the scapegoat role rest, and know that Jung saw scapegoating as one of the oldest and most destructive collective behaviors, a system exporting its own darkness onto its most vulnerable member, and that the suffering of the scapegoat is not the suffering of a flawed person, but the suffering of a person who was given a load that belonged to everyone and told it was theirs alone. The love that was really control. The love that was really control is the relationship that presented itself as caring, but was actually a mechanism of power. The love that protected you by restricting you, that supported you by making you dependent, that held you by making sure you could not leave. Jung understood that love and power can become entangled in ways that the conscious mind does not recognize, because the controlling person often genuinely believes they are loving, and the controlled person often genuinely feels loved. And the confusion between the two is so deep that neither can see the dynamic clearly. The suffering comes when the controlled person begins to grow, to individuate, to become more of themselves, and discovers that the love constricts around the growth, tightening where it should loosen, resisting the very development it claimed to support. Think of a love that felt safe and suffocating at the same time, and how the safety and the suffocation were the same thing, the same arms holding you close and holding you down. You do not need to break free tonight. Let the love rest, controlling and genuine, and know that Jung saw the entanglement of love and power as one of the most confusing sources of suffering, because the person suffering cannot clearly identify the enemy, since the enemy looks exactly like the thing they most need. The pain you can finally hand back. The pain you can finally hand back is the whole of this tear gathered into a single, liberating possibility that some of the suffering you carry was never yours, and that recognizing this is not a betrayal of the people who gave it to you, but a necessary act of psychological honesty. The shadow that was placed on you, the guilt that was given, the shame that was transferred, the expectation that was imposed, the role that was assigned. Each one was a deposit from someone else, placed in you for their reasons, and carried by you as though it were your own. Jung's work was, in many ways, the work of helping people sort the owned from the borrowed, the genuine from the installed, the pain that belongs to them from the pain that belongs to someone else. Think of the heaviest thing you carry and ask, honestly, whether all of it is yours. And if not, consider the possibility that the part that is not yours can, with time and honesty, be gently returned. You do not need to return anything tonight. Let the pain rest, mixed and heavy, and know that Jung saw the sorting as one of the most important and most difficult tasks of the inner life, and that the moment you recognize a piece of your suffering as someone else's, you have already begun to hand it back, not with anger, but with the quiet, firm clarity of a person who has finally learned to distinguish between what is theirs to carry and what was never theirs at all. The night that comes for everyone. The night that comes for everyone is the period of darkness, confusion, and deep suffering that Jung believed was an inevitable part of any life lived with enough depth to matter. He did not see this as a failure or a punishment. He saw it as a necessary passage, a dark night that the soul must cross in order to reach a deeper level of itself. And he observed it in patient after patient. The high-functioning person whose life suddenly lost all meaning. The successful person who collapsed without warning. The ordinary person who woke one morning and found that everything that had sustained them had quietly stopped working. The dark night does not come because you did something wrong. It comes because the life you built has reached its limit, and the self that built it needs to be broken open so that something larger can emerge. Mystics across traditions have described this passage, the stripping away of everything familiar so that something unfamiliar and deeper can arrive. And Jung saw the same process playing out in the secular lives of ordinary people, not as a spiritual event, but as a psychological necessity. Think of the darkest period of your life, and how it came not when things went wrong, but when things stopped making sense, and how the collapse was not of your circumstances, but of the meaning you had given them. You do not need to face any darkness tonight. Let the night rest, arrived or approaching or already past, and know that Jung saw this passage not as the end, but as the crossing, the mandatory dark that lies between the life you had and the life you have not yet discovered. The breakdown that is a breakthrough. The breakdown that is a breakthrough is Jung's most counterintuitive insight about crisis, the understanding that what looks like collapse is often the ego being broken open by the self, the deeper intelligence of the psyche dismantling a structure that has become too small to contain the person growing inside it. The breakdown does not feel like a breakthrough. It feels like dying. The things you relied on stop working. The identity that held you together begins to dissolve. The strategies that got you this far suddenly produce nothing. From the ego's perspective, this is catastrophe. From the self's perspective, it is renovation, the tearing down of walls that were preventing expansion. Jung observed that the breakdowns that could not be traced to external causes, the ones that seemed to come from inside, from nowhere, for no reason, were the most important because they were the self asserting its authority over an ego that had grown too rigid. Think of a collapse in your life that felt like destruction and that later, sometimes years later, revealed itself as the clearing that made room for something better. You do not need to collapse tonight. Let the idea rest. And know that Jung saw the breakdown not as the thing going wrong, but as the thing going right. The psyche performing the demolition that the ego would never have chosen, not out of cruelty, but out of a ruthless, compassionate necessity that only makes sense in hindsight. The depression that calls you down. The depression that calls you down is not, in Jung's view, a disease to be cured, but a descent to be honored. A summons from the depths to come below the surface and attend to what has been neglected. Jung did not romanticize depression. He understood its devastation, its paralysis, its genuine danger. But he also saw in it a purposiveness that the medical model often misses. The observation that depression frequently arrives when a person has been living too much on the surface, too identified with the persona, too disconnected from the depths. And the depression is the psyche's way of pulling them down, forcibly, into the interior they have been avoiding. The downward pull is not a malfunction. It is a correction, an insistence that the surface life is no longer sufficient and that the depths must be attended to. Think of a depression that arrived not after a loss, but after a long period of functioning, as though the functioning itself had been the problem, and how the depression, however terrible, seemed to be pulling you towards something rather than simply pushing you into nothing. You do not need to descend tonight. Let the idea rest, and know that Jung saw certain depressions not as the absence of meaning, but as the demand for deeper meaning. The psyche refusing to let you live on the surface any longer, dragging you downward, not into emptiness, but into the depth where the real work, the work you have been avoiding, finally begins. The midlife crisis, Jung predicted. The midlife crisis, Jung predicted, is not the cliché of sports cars and affairs, but a genuine psychological transition, the moment when the goals of the first half of life stop working and the psyche demands a completely different orientation. Jung saw the first half of life as the time for building the ego, establishing an identity, achieving in the outer world. The second half, he believed, requires a turn inward, a shift from achievement to meaning, from building to understanding, from doing to being. The crisis arrives when the person, still operating on first half of life rules, discovers that the rules have stopped producing results, that the achievements feel hollow, that the identity feels thin, and that something inside is insisting on a change the ego cannot comprehend. Think of the moment, if it has come, when everything you had built stopped satisfying you, when the goals that once drove you felt empty, and how the emptiness was not laziness or failure, but a signal that the game had changed and the old scorecard no longer applied. You do not need to navigate any transition tonight. Let the crisis rest, past or present or future, and know that Jung saw this passage as one of the most important in a human life. The hinge between living outward and living inward, between building a self and understanding it, and that the suffering of the crisis is the suffering of a person being asked, by their own depths, to become someone they have not yet learned to be. The meaning that collapsed. The meaning that collapsed is the framework that held your life together until it did not. The belief system, the narrative, the explanation of why things are the way they are, that sustained you for years, and then, in a single moment or a slow erosion, fell apart. Jung understood that meaning is not a permanent structure but a living one, and that the meanings we build in the first half of life are often not deep enough to sustain the second, and the collapse of a meaning system, while devastating, is the psyche's way of making room for a deeper one. The suffering of the collapsed meaning is the suffering of free fall, the vertigo of a person who is standing on something solid and now stands on nothing. And the nothing, however terrifying, is the necessary space between the old meaning and the new one. Think of a belief that once held everything together and that stopped working, and how the collapse felt like the end of the world rather than the end of a world, a particular world, one that needed to fall so that a larger one could be built. You do not need to build any meaning tonight. Let the collapse rest, carrying its rubble, and know that Jung saw the fallen meaning not as a tragedy but as a clearing, and that the suffering of the emptiness is the birth pain of a meaning that has not yet arrived but is already, quietly, forming in the dark. The identity that had to die. The identity that had to die is the version of yourself that could not make the crossing. The old self that was too small, too rigid, or too defended to pass through the dark night and emerge on the other side. Jung described individuation as requiring a series of deaths, not physical but psychological. The death of the persona that no longer fits. The death of the ego's illusion of control. The death of the identity that was built to please rather than to be. Each death feels real because the identity being lost is the one you know, the one you have been, the only self you have ever experienced from the inside. The new self has not yet arrived, and in the gap between the old identity and the new one, there is only the dark, the confusion, the grief of losing someone you thought you were. Think of a time when who you had been stopped being possible, and how the loss of that identity felt like a death, and how the death, however painful, made room for a person you could not have become without the dying. You do not need to die tonight. Let the old self rest if it has already died, or let it live a little longer if it has not. And know that Jung saw every psychological death as a necessary precondition for a more authentic life, and that the suffering of the dying is the suffering of a person being reborn, which always, always requires first the loss of the person they were. The emptiness before the fullness. The emptiness before the fullness is the period of void that follows the collapse of the old self and precedes the arrival of the new one. And it is, in Jung's understanding, one of the most important and most unbearable phases of the transformation. The old identity has died. The old meaning has collapsed. And in the space they leave behind, there is nothing, no framework, no direction, no sense of who you are or where you are going. The emptiness is not a symptom. It is a stage, a necessary clearing, the dark soil in which the new self is germinating, but has not yet broken the surface. The suffering of this phase is the suffering of waiting in the dark without any assurance that something is coming, of holding nothing and trusting that the nothing will, eventually, become something. Think of a time when everything had fallen away and you were left with nothing but the waiting, and how the waiting, though it felt like dying, was actually the quietest form of becoming. You do not need to wait for anything tonight. Let the emptiness rest, if it is here, and know that Jung saw the void not as the end of the journey, but as its most fertile point, the place where the new self is being assembled in conditions the old self could never have provided. In the dark, in the nothing, in the silence that feels like absence and is actually preparation. The night that stripped you bare. The night that stripped you bare is the phase of the dark night when everything you used to define yourself has been removed. Your role, your certainty, your identity, your defenses, your comfortable story about who you are, and what is left is the raw, unprotected, undisguised person beneath it all. Jung saw this stripping as the psyche's way of reaching the authentic self, which cannot be found beneath the layers until the layers have been removed. The stripping is not gentle. It takes the things you thought you could not live without and shows you that you can, that the person underneath the defenses is still alive, still breathing, still present, and that the defenses, for all their necessity, were also hiding you from yourself. Think of a time when everything was taken, when the roles and the armor and the story all fell away, and how frightened you were, and how, beneath the fear, there was something unexpected, a rawness that was also a kind of freedom, a nakedness that was also a kind of truth. You do not need to be stripped tonight. Let the layers rest, protective and familiar, and know that Jung saw the stripping not as punishment, but as revelation. The dark night showing you who you are without your costume, and the discovery, however painful, that who you are without it is someone worth finding. The ego's defeat as liberation. The ego's defeat as liberation is Jung's most paradoxical truth about the dark night, that the thing the ego fears most, its own humbling, its own loss of control, its own forced recognition that it is not the center of the psyche, is the very thing that sets the person free. The ego fights for its position with everything it has, and the fighting is the primary source of the suffering, because the ego is fighting against a force that is larger and wiser than itself, and the resistance is what creates the pain. The moment the ego stops fighting, the pain changes. It does not vanish. It transforms from the sharp pain of resistance into the gentler ache of surrender. And the surrender, which felt like death from the ego's perspective, feels like relief from the self's. Think of a moment when you stopped fighting something inside yourself, when you gave up the struggle and simply let the larger thing have its way, and how the giving up, which felt like defeat, produced a peace that all the fighting never could. You do not need to surrender anything tonight. Let the ego rest as it rests in sleep, its defenses lowered, its control released, and know that Jung saw the ego's nightly surrender in sleep as a rehearsal for the larger surrender the dark night requires, the letting go that feels like loss and is actually the first moment of a freedom the ego could never, by itself, have found. The descent you did not choose. The descent you did not choose is the recognition that the dark night was not entered voluntarily, that you did not decide to go into the depths, that the depths came for you, pulling you down against your will, and that the descent, however much it looks like a journey, is actually a seizure, the unconscious claiming the person when the person would not come willingly. Jung believed that the descent is almost never voluntary because the ego would never choose its own dissolution, and so the unconscious must take the person by force, through depression, through crisis, through the collapse of everything that held the life together. The suffering of the unwilling descent is compounded by the feeling of powerlessness, the experience of being dragged into darkness by something you cannot see and cannot fight, and the loss of the illusion that you are in control of your own life. Think of how the hardest passages in your life were not entered by choice, but by circumstance, and how the descent, forced and unwanted, was also the passage through which the deepest changes came. You do not need to descend anywhere tonight. Let the depths rest, having already claimed what they needed, and know that Jung saw the involuntary nature of the descent as part of its design. The self, taking the person where they need to go precisely, because the ego would never agree to go there on its own. The bottom where something waited. The bottom where something waited is Jung's most hopeful image of the dark night. The discovery that the descent, however terrible, has a floor, and that on the floor, in the deepest and darkest point of the passage, something is waiting that could not have been found any other way. The bottom is not just the end of the falling. It is a place, a specific location in the psyche where the thing you most need, the insight, the resource, the piece of yourself that was lost, has been resting all along, unreachable from the surface, available only to someone who has descended all the way down. Alchemists called this the nigredo, the blackening, the phase of total darkness that precedes the transformation, and they knew that the gold was hidden in the darkest material, that the treasure was at the bottom of the abyss. Think of the lowest moment of your life and what you found there, the strength, the clarity, the truth that was not available at any higher level, and how the thing that waited at the bottom was often the thing that changed everything. You do not need to reach any bottom tonight. Let it rest, carrying its hidden treasure, and know that Jung saw the bottom not as the end, but as the turning point, the place where the descent becomes an ascent, where the darkness yields its gift, and where the person who is broken open finally finds, in the deepest place, the thing that makes them whole. The dark night as initiation. The dark night as initiation is how Jung understood the entire passage, not as a breakdown to be treated, but as a rite of passage to be survived, an initiation into a deeper level of personhood that cannot be reached through any gentler means. Ancient cultures had initiation rites, ordeals designed to break the young person's old identity so that a new one could emerge. And Jung saw the dark night of the soul as the modern, unstructured equivalent. The same death and rebirth process happening spontaneously in people who have no ritual framework to hold it. The absence of a framework is part of the suffering, because the modern person going through the dark night has no elders to guide them, no community to hold them, no story to tell them that what they are experiencing has a name and an end. They are alone in a process that was never meant to be navigated alone. Think of your hardest passage and how alone you felt in it, and how no one around you seemed to understand what was happening, and how the understanding, when it finally came from inside, because there was no one outside who could provide it. You do not need to be initiated tonight. Let the passage rest, completed or in progress, and know that Jung saw the dark night as an initiation without initiators, a necessary ordeal that transforms the person who survives it, and that the suffering, honestly endured, is the price of admission to a depth of self that no other experience can reach. The dawn you cannot yet see. The dawn you cannot yet see is the promise that sits at the end of the dark night, the understanding that every dark passage, however endless it feels from inside, has a conclusion, and that the conclusion is not death, but transformation. Jung knew this not from theory, but from his own experience, having gone through his own dark night, his own descent into the unconscious, his own period of near dissolution, and having emerged from it with the insights that became the foundation of his life's work. The dark night ended. The dawn came. And the person who emerged was not the person who entered, but someone deeper, wider, more complete, forged by the very darkness that seemed, at the time, to be destroying them. The dawn is not visible from inside the night. That is the cruelest feature of the passage, that it feels endless while it is happening, and that the promise of its ending must be taken on faith rather than sight. Think of a dark passage you survived, and how, while inside it, you could not see the end, and how the end came anyway, not because you found it, but because it found you, arriving in its own time, unmoved by your despair. You do not need to see any dawn tonight. Let the dark rest, complete in itself, and know that Jung spent his life telling people in the night that the dawn was coming, not because he could prove it, but because he had lived it, and the living was enough to make the promise real. The suffering that was teaching you is the pain that carried a lesson. The comfortable life could never have delivered, because some truths can only be learned through the body, through the breaking, through the experience of enduring something you would never have chosen. Jung did not believe that suffering is always meaningful, but he believed it can be made meaningful, that the person who faces their pain honestly and asks what it is teaching, rather than simply trying to escape it, gains something no easy path could provide. The teaching is not in the pain itself. It is in the relationship you develop with the pain, the way you hold it, what you allow it to show you, and whether you are willing to let it change you rather than simply endure it. The same suffering can destroy one person and deepen another, and the difference is not in the suffering, but in the consciousness that meets it. Think of the pain that taught you most, the hurt that showed you something about yourself or about life that you could not have learned any other way, and how the teaching arrived, not despite the suffering, but through it. You do not need to learn anything tonight. Let the lessons rest, carried in the scars, and know that Jung saw the suffering that teaches as one of the most valuable and most expensive experiences a person can have, a tuition paid in pain for a wisdom that cannot be bought any other way, and that the wisdom, once gained, becomes part of you in a way that no comfortable knowledge ever could. The wound that became the healer. The wound that became the healer is Jung's most paradoxical and most compassionate insight. The observation that the place where you are most broken is often the place where your greatest gift is forming. The wounded healer is an ancient archetype, the figure whose capacity to help others comes not from their strength, but from their brokenness. And Jung saw this pattern everywhere. In therapists whose own suffering made them effective, in artists whose pain made their work profound, in ordinary people whose deepest wounds gave them a sensitivity and a compassion that the unwounded simply do not carry. The wound does not automatically become a gift. It must be faced, lived through, and integrated, not denied and not glorified, but honestly held. And the holding, over time, transforms the wound from a liability into a resource. Think of how your own deepest pain has given you something you could not have gained any other way: a knowing, a tenderness, a capacity to sit with someone else's suffering without looking away. You do not need to heal anything tonight. Let the wound rest, carrying its slow transformation, and know that Jung saw the wounded healer not as a consolation prize, but as a genuine truth about how the psyche works, that the break, fully faced, becomes the source of the mending, and that the person who has been most deeply hurt is often the person most deeply equipped to help. The gold hidden in the dark. The gold hidden in the dark is Jung's alchemical metaphor for the value concealed within the most rejected, most despised, most avoided material of the psyche. The alchemists sought to transform base metal into gold, and Jung read this not as chemistry, but as psychology. The transformation of the shadow, the rejected self, the painful material, into something of genuine value. The gold is not found in the light. It is found in the dark, in the very material you have spent your life avoiding, in the feelings you have refused to feel, in the parts of yourself you have declared worthless. The suffering of avoidance, the energy spent keeping the dark material at bay, is the suffering of a person standing on a treasure they will not dig, because the digging requires going into the only place they refuse to go. Think of the thing in yourself you most avoid, the feeling, the memory, the quality, and consider that buried inside it, inseparable from the darkness, is something of genuine value, a strength, a truth, a capacity that can only be reached by going into the dark and bringing it back. You do not need to dig tonight. Let the gold rest, buried and patient, and know that Jung spent his life telling people that the treasure they seek is hidden in the place they least want to look, and that the avoidance is the only thing standing between them and the richest part of themselves. The pain that built your compassion. The pain that built your compassion is the suffering that gave you the ability to understand others, not from the outside, but from the inside, because you have been where they are. And the being there gave you a knowledge that no theory and no observation can match. Jung saw compassion not as a moral achievement, but as a consequence of integrated suffering, the natural result of a person who has faced their own pain and emerged with an understanding that extends, automatically, to others in similar pain. The person who has not suffered cannot truly understand the person who is suffering, because understanding, in this sense, is not intellectual but experiential. And the experiential knowledge comes only from having been through it yourself. Think of how your own pain changed the way you relate to others' pain, how the suffering you went through gave you a capacity for empathy that was not there before, how the person you became through the pain is a person who can hold space for someone else's pain without flinching. You do not need to be compassionate toward anyone tonight. Let the compassion rest, built from your own suffering, and know that Jung saw this as one of the most honest gifts the dark night gives, not happiness, not success, not the absence of pain, but the presence of a compassion so deep and so real that it can only be forged in the very fire that hurt you, and that carries, inside its warmth, the proof that the suffering was not wasted. The loss that gave you depth. The loss that gave you depth is the thing that was taken from you, and that, in its taking, carved a space inside you that was not there before, a depth that the having could never have produced. Jung saw depth as one of the primary gifts of suffering, the understanding that a life untouched by loss is a life without dimension, pleasant on the surface, but lacking the interior space that loss creates. The depth is literal, a psychological depth, a capacity to feel, to understand, to perceive layers that the person who is not lost cannot see. The loss hollowed you out, and the hollowing, which felt like destruction, was also a making, the creation of interior space, of room for feelings and perceptions that had nowhere to live before the loss carved the chamber. Think of how differently you perceive the world after a significant loss. How the loss gave you access to a register of feeling that was not available before. How the depth, however painful, has made you more fully human. You do not need to lose anything tonight. Let the depth rest, carved and present, and know that Jung saw loss not as something to be recovered from, but as something to be integrated. The hollow becoming a holding space, the absence becoming a room, and the depth itself becoming one of the most valuable things the suffering left behind. The crisis that found your strength. The crisis that found your strength is the moment when the worst thing revealed the best thing, when the collapse of everything you relied on forced you to discover a resource inside yourself that you did not know was there. Jung saw this as one of the reliable patterns of the dark night, that the crisis, by removing external supports, forces the person onto internal ones, and the internal supports, never tested before, turn out to be far stronger than the person imagined. The strength was always there. It was hidden, not by the person's weakness, but by the presence of the external supports, which made the internal ones unnecessary. The crisis removed the scaffolding, and the person, to their own astonishment, did not fall, but stood, supported by something inside that had been waiting, unused, for exactly this moment. Think of a crisis that revealed a strength you did not know you had, a capacity for endurance, for calm, for clarity, that appeared only when everything else was gone. You do not need to be strong tonight. Let the strength rest, discovered and quiet, and know that Jung saw the crisis as one of the most reliable ways the psyche introduces a person to their own depth, removing the external so that the internal can finally be found, and that the strength the crisis revealed was never given to you by the crisis. It was always yours. The crisis simply removed everything that was standing in front of it. The breaking that made you flexible. The breaking that made you flexible is the fracture in your rigidity that allowed you, finally, to bend rather than shatter, because the person you were before the breaking was too rigid to survive what was coming. And the breaking, which felt like destruction, was actually the installation of flexibility, the creation of joints in a structure that had none. Jung saw psychological rigidity as one of the greatest dangers of the persona, the fixed, inflexible self that can function perfectly in predictable conditions and shatters the moment the conditions change. The breaking is what happens when the rigid self meets a reality it cannot control, and the fracture, rather than ending the structure, saves it, introducing the flexibility that the original construction lacked. Think of how you were before something broke you, and how the breaking, though it hurt, made you softer, more adaptable, more able to bend with life rather than resist it, and how the person you are now, less rigid and more resilient, is a person the unbroken version could not have become. You do not need to break tonight. Let the fractures rest. carrying their gift of flexibility. And know that Jung saw the breaking not as a loss of strength, but as a gain of something more valuable, the ability to move with life rather than against it, a capacity that rigidity could never provide and that only the breaking could install. The loneliness that taught you to be. The loneliness that taught you to be with yourself is the isolation that forced you into your own company, and the discovery, painful and gradual, that your own company is sufficient. Jung saw solitude as an essential condition for individuation, the process of becoming whole, and he understood that many people avoid being alone because being alone means being with the parts of themselves they have been running from. The loneliness was not the problem. The problem was the avoidance. And the loneliness, by removing the distractions, forced the meeting. The meeting with yourself, which solitude makes unavoidable, is one of the most frightening and most rewarding experiences the psyche can have. Because the self you meet in solitude is the whole self, shadow and all. And learning to be with that self without distraction is the beginning of a peace that no company can provide. Think of a period of loneliness that felt unbearable, and how, inside the loneliness, you found a relationship with yourself that the busy life had prevented. You do not need to be alone tonight. Let the loneliness rest, if it is here, and know that Jung saw the capacity to be with yourself as one of the greatest achievements of the inner life, and that the loneliness that forced you into your own company may have been the most important introduction of your life. The failure that redirected you. The failure that redirected you is the thing that went wrong, that turned out eventually to have sent you in the right direction, because the path you were on, however comfortable, was not the path the deeper self needed, and the failure, by closing that path, opened the one you were supposed to be walking. Jung saw certain failures not as endings, but as corrections. The self overriding the ego's plan and steering the person through collapse toward a destination the ego would never have chosen. The failure did not feel like redirection. It felt like destruction. And the time between the failure and the recognition that the failure was a gift can be years, during which the person suffers the loss without seeing the gain. Think of a failure that redirected your life, a path that closed and forced you onto another, and how the forced path turned out to be more authentic, more yours, more aligned with who you actually are. You do not need to fail at anything tonight. Let the old failure rest, carrying its hidden gift, and know that Jung saw the ego's plans as often being the obstacle to the self's direction, and that the failure, when it comes, may be the self's way of removing an obstacle the ego mistook for the goal. The grief that opened your heart. The grief that opened your heart is the loss that broke through the armor you had built around your capacity to feel. The sorrow so deep it cracked the defenses and let the feeling in, and the person who emerged from the grief, though wounded, was also more open, more tender, more capable of love than the person who entered it. Jung understood that grief is one of the most powerful forces in the psyche, not because it destroys, but because it opens, breaking the ego's protective shell and exposing the raw, undefended heart beneath. The heart that grief opens is not a weak heart. It is a heart that can hold more, that has been enlarged by the loss, that carries both the sorrow and the capacity for a love that was not available before the sorrow came. Think of how grief changed your capacity to feel, how the loss, however devastating, left you more open, more able to receive and to give, more fully alive to the emotional depth that the defended self could never reach. You do not need to grieve tonight. Let the heart rest, opened and tender, And know that Jung saw grief as one of the great heart openers, the force that breaks through the armor not to destroy, but to reveal. And that the heart that emerges from grief, however wounded, is a heart that has been made larger, not smaller, by the breaking. The suffering that made you real. The suffering that made you real is the pain that burned away the pretense, the performance, the constructed surface, and left behind a person who is not polished but genuine, not perfect but honest, not comfortable but alive. Jung saw authenticity as the product of suffering, not because suffering is good, but because the persona, the constructed self, can only be maintained in conditions of relative comfort and suffering. By removing the comfort, removes the persona's support structure and forces the real person to emerge. The person made real by suffering is not a better person in the conventional sense. They are a truer person, one who has been stripped of the ability to pretend and left with nothing but what is actually there. Think of how your suffering changed you, not into someone nicer or more successful, but into someone more real, more honest, more unable to maintain the performance that the comfortable life required. You do not need to become anything tonight. Let the realness rest, arrive through suffering, and know that Jung saw the suffering that strips away the pretense as one of the most painful and most valuable things that can happen to a person. Because the person who has been made real by pain can never fully return to the performance. And the inability to pretend, however inconvenient, is also a kind of freedom. The meaning you made from the pain. The meaning you made from the pain is the whole of this tear gathered into a single warm recognition that the suffering you have endured was not wasted. Not because it was designed to teach you something, but because you, through your own courage and your own honesty, chose to find something valuable in it rather than let it destroy you. Jung did not believe that suffering has inherent meaning. He believed that meaning can be created from suffering by a consciousness willing to face the pain honestly and ask what it reveals. The meaning is not in the pain, it is in the person who meets the pain, in the relationship between the suffering and the consciousness that holds it. And that relationship, when it is honest, produces something that neither the suffering nor the consciousness could produce alone. Think of the meaning you have made from your own pain, the wisdom, the compassion, the depth, and how the making was not automatic but chosen, an act of courage that transformed raw hurt into something you can carry with dignity. You do not need to make any more meaning tonight. Let the meaning rest, handmade and real, and know that Jung saw this as the highest human achievement, not the avoidance of suffering, but the transformation of it, the alchemical act of turning the darkest material into gold, performed not by magic, but by a person willing to hold the darkness long enough for the gold to show through. The peace that is not the absence. The peace that is not the absence of pain is the peace Jung was pointing toward all along. The quiet that comes not from the removal of suffering, but from the honest relationship with it. This is not the peace of someone who has never been hurt. It is the peace of someone who has been hurt deeply, who has faced the hurt without flinching, and who has found, on the other side of the facing, a stillness that the avoidance could never provide. The avoidance of suffering produces anxiety because the thing being avoided is still there, generating pressure. The facing of suffering produces peace because the thing that was feared has been met, and the meeting, however painful, resolved the tension that the avoidance was creating. Jung saw this as the deepest paradox of psychological life, that running from pain produces more suffering, and turning toward it produces peace. Not because the pain disappears, but because the relationship to it changes. from resistance to acceptance, from fighting to holding, from enemy to companion. Think of how much of your suffering has been the suffering of avoidance, the pain of running from pain, and how the moments when you finally stopped running and turned to face what you feared were the moments when the peace arrived. You do not need to face anything tonight. Let the peace rest, arrived or approaching, and know that Jung saw this peace not as a reward for courage, but as the natural consequence of honesty, the quiet that comes when the fighting stops, when the running ends, and when the person, finally, allows themselves to be with what is. The acceptance Jung spoke of. The acceptance Jung spoke of is not resignation, not giving up, not the passive surrender of a person who has stopped trying. It is the active, courageous, clear-eyed recognition of what is, the willingness to see your life, your wounds, your shadow, your suffering, exactly as they are, without the distortion of denial and without the inflation of drama. Jung wrote that we cannot change anything until we accept it. And he meant something specific, that the thing resisted cannot be transformed because resistance locks it in place, and only acceptance, which removes the resistance, frees the thing to change. The paradox is real and counterintuitive, that the suffering you accept begins to transform, while the suffering you fight remains exactly where it is, held in place by the very energy you are using to push it away. Think of how long you have fought certain aspects of yourself, and how the fighting has not changed them, and how the rare moments of genuine acceptance, of simply allowing the difficult thing to be there, produced more movement than years of resistance. You do not need to accept anything tonight. Let the idea rest, paradoxical and true, and know that the acceptance Jung spoke of is not the end of the work, but its beginning. The first honest act from which all transformation follows, the quiet, radical decision to stop fighting what is, and start instead to be with it, fully, clearly, without flinching, and to discover that what is, once accepted, is already beginning to become what it needs to be. The wholeness that includes the hurt. The wholeness that includes the hurt is the vision of the complete self that Jung spent his life articulating, a self that is not defined by its best qualities or its worst, but by its willingness to contain both, to hold the light and the shadow, the strength and the wound, the wisdom and the confusion, in a single, imperfect, fully inhabited life. This wholeness is not perfection. It is the opposite of perfection. It is the integration of everything, including the things that hurt, including the parts that were damaged, including the suffering that seemed, at the time, to be destroying you. The hurt is not excluded from the whole self. It is woven into it, one thread among many, contributing its particular color, its particular depth, to the fabric of a person who has stopped trying to be only one thing and has begun, at last, to be everything they are. Think of how much energy you have spent trying to be whole by excluding the hurt, and how the excluding was the very thing that prevented the wholeness, because a whole that leaves something out is not whole at all. You do not need to include anything tonight. Let the wholeness rest, imperfect and complete, and know that Jung saw the inclusion of the hurt as the final act of self-acceptance. The moment when the person stops dividing themselves into good and bad and begins to hold the whole of what they are, damaged and beautiful, wounded and wise, imperfect and finally complete. The self that survived everything. The self that survived everything is the one lying here tonight, the one that made it through every wound, every crisis, every dark night, every loss, every moment that felt like the end and was not. This self is not unmarked. It carries every scar, every lesson, every piece of the darkness it passed through, and the carrying is visible in the lines of the face, in the depth of the eyes, in the quiet way the person holds themselves, the unmistakable bearing of someone who has been through something and come out the other side. Jung did not admire the untested person. He admired the tested one, the person whose character was forged not by ease, but by endurance, and whose presence carries the particular gravity that only suffering, honestly endured, can produce. Think of everything you have survived, and how the surviving did not just keep you alive, but made you into the specific person you are, and how that person, scarred and standing, is more real, more substantial, more fully here than the untested version could ever have been. You do not need to survive anything tonight. Let the survivor rest as they deserve to rest, carrying their particular weight with the quiet dignity of someone who has been through the fire and did not turn away. And know that Jung would look at the person lying here tonight and see not a victim of suffering, but a product of it, shaped by the dark into someone the light alone could never have made. The compassion you earned the hard way. The compassion you earned the hard way is not the compassion of someone who read about suffering. It is the compassion of someone who lived it, whose body knows what the body feels in pain, whose mind knows the specific texture of despair, whose heart was broken open by their own crisis, and now, because it was broken, can hold more than it could before. This compassion was not given freely. It was earned through experience, through the dark nights and the unnamed pain and the suffering that had no cause and no cure, and the earning was not a transaction, but a transformation. The slow alchemy of a person who was hurt, and, through the hurting, was changed into someone capable of a depth of understanding that the unhurt cannot access. Jung saw this as the wounded healer in its most personal form, the compassion that comes not from above, but from beside, not from a position of strength, but from a shared experience of weakness. Think of how your own suffering gave you the capacity to truly be with someone in theirs. You do not need to be compassionate tonight. Let the compassion rest, earned and real, and know that the kindness you are capable of now, the deep, quiet, unperformative kindness that comes from knowing what pain feels like from the inside, is one of the most valuable things your suffering has produced, and that it could not have been gained any other way. The person your suffering made. The person your suffering made is not who you would have been without it. And this is neither a tragedy nor a triumph, but simply the truth. The suffering changed you. It took the person you were and replaced them with someone different, someone deeper, someone with more scars and more capacity, someone who sees the world through eyes that were changed by what they saw. You cannot go back to the person you were before the suffering, and the person you are now, however much they miss the innocence of the earlier version, carries something the earlier version could not: a knowledge, a weight, a way of being in the world that comes only from having passed through something you would never have chosen. Jung did not pity the person made by suffering. He respected them, because the making was not passive. It required the person's participation, their willingness to endure honestly rather than collapse into bitterness, and the result, the person standing on the other side, is someone who chose, in the face of pain, to let the pain make them rather than break them. You do not need to be anyone other than who you are tonight. Let the person your suffering made rest, exactly as they are, carrying everything the suffering gave them. And know that the person lying here is not a diminished version of who they were, but a deepened one, shaped by forces they did not choose, into someone they could not have predicted, and that the shaping, however painful, was also a kind of making. The quiet strength of having endured. The quiet strength of having endured is the understated, unremarkable, non-dramatic resilience of a person who simply kept going through something that gave them every reason to stop. This strength does not announce itself. It does not flex. It does not perform. It simply is. The steady presence of someone who was tested and did not break, who carried a weight that no one else could see and continued to function, continued to love, continued to show up, day after day, with a quiet persistence that is, in its own unspoken way, one of the most profound forms of courage a person can embody. Jung saw this endurance not as the absence of feeling, but as the presence of a will deeper than the pain, a commitment to living that survived the darkest reasons to stop, not because the person was stronger than their suffering, but because something in them, the self, the deeper center, simply would not let them give up. Think of how you endured, and how ordinary it looked from outside, and how extraordinary it felt from inside, and how no one will ever fully know what the enduring cost you. You do not need to endure anything tonight. Let the strength rest, quiet and hard-won, and know that the endurance you showed, the simple act of continuing, is one of the bravest things you have ever done, and that the person who kept going through the dark did so not because they had answers, but because they had something better, which was the refusal, quiet and stubborn and absolutely sufficient, to stop. The life that is enough as it is. The life that is enough as it is does not need to be fixed, improved, optimized, or compared. It needs only to be lived honestly, with the fullness that Jung described, which is not the fullness of having everything, but the fullness of being everything. The light and the shadow, the wound and the gift, the suffering and the meaning made from it. Jung did not promise that individuation would produce happiness. He promised depth, and the depth, he believed, was worth more than the happiness, because happiness is a surface state that comes and goes, while depth is a permanent structure that holds everything, the joy and the sorrow, the ease and the difficulty, in a single, capacious life. Think of your life as it is, not as it should be, not as it could have been, but as it actually is, tonight, with all its imperfections and all its particular unrepeatable beauty, and consider that this life, exactly this one, is enough. You do not need to improve anything tonight. Let the life rest, as it is, and know that Jung saw the sufficient life not as the perfect life, but as the lived life, the one that was inhabited fully, suffered through honestly, and accepted without the demand that it be anything other than what it is. The rest that suffering owes you. The rest that suffering owes you is the quiet recognition that you have earned a pause, that the work of facing your pain, carrying your wounds, enduring your dark night, and finding meaning in the darkness entitles you, tonight, to simply stop. You have done enough. You have suffered enough. You have been honest enough and brave enough and enduring enough. And the rest that is coming is not laziness or avoidance, but the natural, earned, deserved cessation of a person who has been working very hard for a very long time at the hardest thing a person can do, which is to be fully, honestly, painfully alive. Jung did not demand that his patients suffer more. He asked them to suffer honestly, and then he asked them to rest, because the psyche, like the body, needs recovery after exertion. And the exertion of facing the dark is one of the most demanding things a human being can do. Think of how tired you are, not just physically but existentially, and how the tiredness is not a weakness, but a measure of how hard you have been working, in silence, at the work of being yourself. You do not need to work any harder tonight. Let the rest come, freely and without guilt, and know that the suffering, honestly endured, owes you this: a pause, a breath, a night of simply being held by the quiet, without any demand, without any agenda, without any need to be anything other than tired and resting, and finally, gently done. The gentle truth Jung left behind. The gentle truth Jung left behind is simple enough to carry into sleep. You suffer because you are more than you have been allowed to be, and the suffering is the voice of the parts that were excluded, the parts that are asking to return. The pain is not a punishment. It is a signal, pointing at the life that is waiting beneath the life you have been living, the self that is waiting beneath the self you have been showing. Jung spent his life helping people hear the signal and follow it, not away from the pain, but through it, toward a wholeness that includes everything: the hurt and the healing, the dark and the light, the wound and the gift. Let this truth settle gently now. You are more than you have been allowed to be, and the suffering, when you are ready, will show you where the more is hiding. But not tonight. Tonight, let it all rest. The pain that finally softens. The pain that finally softens is what happens when you stop holding it so tightly. When the grip loosens and the suffering, held gently instead of fought, begins to change its texture, from sharp to dull, from urgent to quiet, from a wound to an ache to a tenderness that is almost, in its own way, a kind of warmth. The softening is not a cure. It is a change in relationship, the pain becoming something you carry rather than something that carries you. And the carrying, which once felt impossible, becomes ordinary, becomes bearable, becomes simply part of being alive. Let the pain soften now, as it softens when the body relaxes and the mind stops reaching. Let it become the quiet ache it becomes when you are too tired to fight it, and feel how the ache, held gently in the dark, is almost companionable, almost warm, almost something you could rest beside. Let it soften, let it be soft. The sleep that holds you now. The sleep that holds you now is where all suffering rests. There is nothing more to understand tonight, nothing more to face or carry or transform. Jung's truths have done their work. Gently, in the dark, and what remains is only this: the warmth of the blanket, the weight of the body, the slow breath, and a stillness that asks nothing of you at all. The suffering is resting now. The wounds are resting. The shadow, the persona, the complex, the unlived life, all of it is quiet, held in the same dark that holds you, carried by the same silence that carries you towards sleep. You have suffered enough for one night. You have understood enough. You have been brave enough. And the rest that is coming is not an escape from the pain, but a gentle pause in its company. The two of you lying side by side, the suffering and the person who carries it, both of them tired, both of them real, both of them ready, at last, for the quiet. Let the sleep take you. Let the pain rest. Let yourself, at last, be held.